In the summer of 1979, Odessa Whitlock stood alone at her husband's grave, dirt still fresh beneath her boots, and walked straight from the funeral to the livestock auction without changing her black dress. Men turned to stare. She didn't stop. She raised her hand and bought 6 donkeys. Nobody wanted the ugliest, meanest, most worthless animals in Coyote County. The auctioneer laughed. The whole yard laughed. Nobody knew that Widow wasn't buying pack animals. She was buying the only thing standing between her and losing everything she had left. The dirt hadn't even settled on Ellis Whitlock's grave when Odessa walked away from it. She didn't look back at the mound. She didn't look at her sister-in-law, who stood there with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth like she was the one who'd lost a husband. She didn't look at the preacher who was still saying words nobody was listening to anymore. She walked straight to the wagon, climbed up, and took the reins in her bare hands. "Odessa!" Her sister-in-law's voice cracked behind her. "Where in God's name are you going?" "Into town," Odessa said. "Today Ellis isn't even cold." "I know exactly how cold my husband is, Beatrice. I'm the one who washed him." She snapped the reins before Beatrice could answer, and the wagon lurched forward, and that was the last anyone in her family saw of her grief. Because Odessa Whitlock had already decided something standing over that grave, something she hadn't said out loud to a single living soul. She was not going to lose the ranch, too. The auction yard was already loud when she arrived, dust hanging in the air, men shouting numbers over the bleating of animals nobody wanted enough to bid high on. She climbed down from the wagon still wearing her funeral black, and the first man who noticed her stopped talking mid-sentence. "Ma'am?" He tipped his hat, uncertain. "Ain't this the Whitlock funeral today?" "It was," Odessa said. "Now it's an auction. I intend to participate in both." She walked past him before he could find words for that. Heads turned as she moved through the crowd. She heard the whispers start behind her quiet, at first the way gossip always starts quiet before it finds its legs. "That's Ellis Whitlock's widow. Buried him this morning, didn't they? What in the world is she doing here?" She kept walking. She'd spent 6 years married to a man who taught her that if you stopped every time someone whispered about you, you'd never get anywhere at all. Ellis used to say it while he worked sweat-cutting lines down his neck, never once looking up to see who was staring. "Let them talk, Des. Talk's free. Land ain't." She found the auctioneer's platform and stood at the edge of it close enough that the man running the bidding couldn't pretend not to see her. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat with the same uncertain courtesy as the man before him. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mrs. Whitlock. Awful sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Odessa said. "What's coming up next?" He blinked at her. "Ma'am." "The lot. What's next?" He glanced down at his ledger, like it might give him permission to say what he wanted to say, which was that a woman who'd buried her husband 4 hours ago probably ought to be home crying into a pillow, not standing in a dirt yard, asking about livestock lots. But there was something in her face that stopped him from saying it. "Donkeys," he said finally. 6 of them. Nobody wants them." "Why not?" "They're mean for one. Kicked a hand over at the Ruger place so bad he still walks with a limp. Old 2 past their working years, most of them. And they eat like horses but pull half what a mule does." He shook his head. "Honestly, ma'am, I was fixing to just give 'em away rather than waste time bidding on 'em." "Don't give them away," Odessa said. "I'll bid." The auctioneer stared at her. Behind her, the whispering had stopped being whispering. It had become open talk loud enough that she was clearly meant to hear it. "She wants the donkeys. The mean ones, the Ruger donkeys." Lord Grief does strange things to a woman. Odessa didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the pen where the animals stood, 6 of them all bone and stubbornness ears pinned back at every man who came near the fence. One of them, a gray jenny with a torn ear, locked eyes with Odessa and didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't do a single thing to make herself likable. Odessa found that she liked her immediately. The bidding started low, because nobody else wanted to bid at all. Odessa raised her hand at the opening number, and the auctioneer, startled, called it out. And there was a beat of silence before anyone thought to bid against her. Not because they wanted the donkeys, but because it felt wrong to let a grieving widow walk off with 6 half-wild animals without at least pretending there was competition. A man near the front, heavy-set silver watch chain catching the light. The kind of man who wore his money where everyone could see it raise 2 fingers lazily. "I'll go $2 over," he said, not even looking at the pen. "Just to keep things honest." Odessa turned to look at him for the first time. "Caleb Rourke," she said. "Mrs. Whitlock." He smiled at her, the kind of smile that had never once meant anything kind. "My condolences. Ellis was a fine man. Shame about the ranch too, I hear. Banks circling, isn't it?" The crowd went quiet in a different way now, the way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes they're about to watch something. "My ranch is my business, Mr. Rourke. Just making conversation, ma'am." He spread his hands, all false innocence. "Though I'll say spending money on donkeys nobody wants, day you bury your husband. That's a curious way to handle a widow's business. Man might wonder if you've got any business sense left in you at all." "A man might wonder a lot of things," Odessa said. "Doesn't make him right about any of them." Somebody in the crowd laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh quickly swallowed. Rourke's jaw tightened. $3, he said to the auctioneer, not smiling anymore. "4, Odessa said. 5. 6. The auctioneer's eyes flicked between them like he was watching a gunfight instead of a bid on donkeys. And maybe he was, because everyone in that yard understood the way people always understand things they can't quite explain, that this had stopped being about animals a long time ago. $10, Rourke said, and there was an edge in it now, the sound of a man who wasn't used to being made to work for anything. The crowd murmured. $10 was a foolish sum for animals nobody wanted an hour ago. Odessa felt every eye in the yard swing toward her, waiting to see if the grieving widow would fold. She had $11 to her name after the funeral costs. She knew that number the way she knew the sound of Ellis's voice, the way she knew every ache left behind in an empty bed. $11 and a ranch with a mortgage. The bank was already sharpening its teeth over, and a man standing in front of her who wanted nothing more than to watch her lose. 11, she said. The yard went dead silent. Rourke stared at her. For one long moment, Odessa thought he might go higher, just out of spite, might spend money he didn't need to spend simply to watch her walk home with nothing. Men like Caleb Rourke did that. She'd watched him do it to smaller men her whole life, buy land nobody wanted, just to keep a neighbor from having it run prices up on tools and seed, just to watch a struggling family sweat. But $11 for 6 mean old worthless donkeys was a bridge. Even Rourke's pride wouldn't cross in front of a crowd. "They're yours," he said, and there was something ugly under the words now, something that promised this wasn't finished. "Enjoy your inheritance, Mrs. Whitlock." "Sold," the auctioneer said quickly, like he wanted the moment over with. "Sold to Mrs. Whitlock, $11. Odessa walked to the pen without looking at Rourke again. She counted out every coin she had into the auctioneer's palm, and when it was done, she had exactly nothing left. Not a cent for feed, not a cent for the road home. Nothing but 6 donkeys nobody wanted, and a wagon that needed a horse she couldn't afford to feed either. She opened the gate. The gray Jenny with the torn ear stepped forward first, and Odessa reached out and set her palm flat against the animal's nose, and the Jenny didn't pull away. "Well," Odessa said quietly, only to the donkey, only to herself. "Guess it's you and me now." Behind her she heard Rourke's voice carry across the yard to whoever was standing near him. "Woman's gone soft in the head. Grief'll do that. Give it a month, bank'll have that land back anyway, and those donkeys'll be dead in a ditch." Odessa didn't turn around. She led the 6 animals out of the pen, 1 rope in each hand, 3 trailing behind on lead lines. She tied herself, and she walked them straight through the middle of the yard, past every whispering mouth, past every pair of eyes that expected her to break. She did not break. The walk back to the ranch took 4 hours on foot. 6 donkeys in tow, no wagon horse to speak of, because she'd sold the last one 3 weeks ago to pay the doctor who couldn't save Ellis anyway. By the time she reached her own gate, the sun was dropping low and orange, and her feet had blistered clean through her funeral boots, and she was so tired she could have laid down in the dirt and slept there. She didn't. She led the donkeys into the empty barn, the one that used to hold 2 good horses and a milk cow before the debts started eating everything Ellis built, and she latched the gate, and she stood there in the near dark, looking at 6 animals that represented every cent she had left in the world. "You'd better be worth it," she told them. None of them answered, of course. The Jenny with the torn ear just watched her ears swiveling, and something about that steady, unbothered gaze made Odessa's throat tighten in a way the whole funeral hadn't managed. She sat down on an overturned bucket and put her face in her hands, and for the first time since she'd stood over Ellis's grave that morning, she let herself cry, not loud, not long. Just a handful of minutes she allowed herself, because there was nobody there to see it and nobody there to judge her for it. Then she wiped her face and stood up and went to check the fence line, because crying didn't feed donkeys, and it didn't pay debts, and it certainly didn't stop Caleb Rourke from circling her land like a buzzard, waiting for something to die. She found the hole in the north fence just before full dark. 3 rails down, chewed through by something with teeth, coyote tracks pressed deep into the soft dirt on either side. Odessa crouched and studied the tracks for a long moment. Not one animal, but several moving together, moving deliberate. She'd heard the stories, same as anyone in the county. A bad coyote season worse than anyone could remember. Ranchers losing calves and lambs faster than they could count them. Whole flocks gutted overnight, while men slept 50 yards away with rifles propped uselessly by the door. Ellis used to say coyotes didn't come for stupid animals. They came for weak fences and weaker will. She didn't have money to fix the fence proper. She didn't have money for much of anything, but she had 6 donkeys standing in a barn who'd cost her every last coin. And she had a memory, faint, half-formed, something her grandmother used to say decades ago about the old country, about animals that didn't run from wolves, but stood and fought them. She hadn't bought those donkeys because she was desperate. She'd bought them because of that memory, small and strange as it was, and because desperate women sometimes remembered things sensible women had long since let go of. The knock came at her door just past sundown, hard enough to rattle the frame. Odessa opened it to find her husband's uncle William Hargrove standing there with his hat in his hands and an expression that was trying very hard to look sympathetic, and mostly succeeding at looking impatient. "William," she said. "Odessa." He stepped past her without being invited the way families sometimes assumed they had the right to. "I heard what you did at the auction today." News travels fast. News travels fast when it's foolish. He turned to face her, and there was something almost gentle in his tone, the kind of gentleness men used right before they said something cruel and called it kindness. "You spent your last dollar on donkeys, Odessa, on the day you buried my nephew." "I'm aware of what day it was. Then you understand why I'm here." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it toward her like it was a gift instead of a blade. "I'm prepared to buy the land, fair price, more than fair considering the state of things. You could take that money, move into town, start fresh somewhere. The bank isn't breathing down your neck." Odessa looked at the paper. She didn't take it. "This was Ellis's land," she said. "His father's before him. You think I buried my husband this morning so I could hand his life's work to you by sundown? I think you're a widow with no income, no husband, and no sense left in her to run a cattle operation alone. I think in 6 months the bank takes this land whether you sell it to me or not, and you'll have gotten nothing for it instead of something." "Then I'll lose it with something to show for the fight," Odessa said. "Get out of my house, William." His jaw worked. For a moment she thought he might argue further, might push the paper into her hands, whether she wanted it or not. Instead, he folded it back into his coat, slow and deliberate, a man banking his patience for later use. "You'll come around," he said. "Grief makes people stubborn before it makes them sensible. I'll be here when you're ready to be sensible." He left without another word, and Odessa stood in her doorway watching his shadow disappear down the road, and she understood with total clarity that between Rourke circling from one direction and William circling from the other, she had exactly 1 season to prove this land was still worth fighting for. One seasoned 6 donkeys and a fence that coyotes had already found. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low, going through the papers Ellis had left behind. Bills, debts, the mortgage note with its due date circled in his own careful hand, a due date that sat exactly 4 months out. 4 months to prove something. 4 months, or lose everything. She thought about her grandmother's stories again. The fragments she could remember through the fog of a childhood half-forgotten animals raised alongside sheep, bonded to them since birth, standing their ground when wolves came instead of scattering. She'd always assumed it was just an old woman's fireside talk, the kind of story told to children who didn't know enough to doubt it. But she had 6 donkeys in her barn bought with her last dollar out of something closer to instinct than sense. And she had a coyote problem eating through every ranch in the county. And she had nothing left to lose by trying. At first light, she was back at the barn, standing at the gate, studying the 6 animals that stared back at her with no particular interest in her plans. "All right," she said to them. "Let's see what you're good for." She didn't have sheep of her own, not anymore. Sold off same as the horses to keep the doctor paid, which meant the first thing she needed wasn't training. It was animals worth protecting in the first place. And that meant money she didn't have for livestock, she couldn't afford on land, the bank was already circling. She was still standing there, working through the impossible arithmetic of it, when she heard hoofbeats on the road, slow and unhurried, and looked up to see a rider she didn't recognize easing his horse toward her gate. He stopped a respectful distance off and tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Didn't mean to intrude. Heard in town you bought yourself some donkeys nobody wanted." "News travels fast in this county," Odessa said for the second time in as many days. "Faster than most places I've been." He swung down off his horse easy and unhurried, and there was something in the way he moved that told her he wasn't a man used to being watched and didn't much care either way. "Name's Nathaniel Cole. I run a small spread 2 miles east. Been having coyote trouble myself. Lost 4 lambs last week alone." "Sorry to hear it." "Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't stop it." He nodded toward the barn behind her. "Those the donkeys from the Rourke bidding war, whole town's talking about it. Man tried to run your price up out of spite, and you outlasted him." Word really does travel. In a county this size, ma'am, a woman standing her ground against Caleb Rourke is the best story anybody's had in months. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful behind his eyes. "You planning on using those donkeys for something specific, or was that just a way of denying Rourke a victory?" Odessa considered lying. Considered telling him it was none of his business, which it wasn't. But there was something steady in his face, something that didn't carry the mockery she'd heard from every other mouth in the county since sunup yesterday, and she found herself answering honestly instead. "My grandmother used to say animals raised with a flock will fight for that flock like it's their own," she said. "I don't rightly know if that's true or just an old story, but I've got 6 donkeys a coyote problem and nothing left to lose finding out." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, studying her the way a man studies a hand of cards he wasn't expecting to be dealt. "That's not an old story," he said finally. "My father ran cattle in the nations before I was born. Saw it done there, donkeys and mules both raised in with the herd from young. Saw it work too, coyotes wouldn't come within a quarter mile of a pasture with a trained jenny standing watch." He nodded slowly. "It's not foolishness, Mrs. Whitlock. It's old knowledge most folks around here never bothered learning." Something loosened in Odessa's chest, some tightness she hadn't known she was carrying until a stranger on a horse told her she wasn't crazy. "You know how it's done?" she asked. "The training of it. I've seen it done. That's different from doing it myself." He glanced toward the pen, toward the gray Jenny, watching them both with her torn ear twitching. "But I imagine between what I saw and what your grandmother remembered, we could piece together enough to try." "We," Odessa repeated. "If you'll have the help, ma'am, no charge. I've got my own coyote problem to solve, and it seems to me we might solve it faster working the puzzle together than apart." He tipped his hat again, waiting on her answer with a patience that surprised her. Odessa looked past him down the road toward town, in the direction Caleb Rourke's ranch sat fat and comfortable on land he'd taken from smaller men over 20 years. She looked back toward the house where William Hargrove's folded paper still sat on her kitchen table, waiting for her to change her mind. Then she looked at the barn at 6 donkeys nobody in the county had wanted an hour before she raised her hand at that auction. "All right, Mr. Cole," she said. "Let's see what we can build." She didn't know yet, couldn't have known, standing in that yard with the sun barely up, and the whole county already laughing behind her back, that this was the first morning of a war. Not the kind fought with rifles, though there would be blood before it ended. A quieter war fought with fence posts and stubbornness, and 6 animals nobody else had wanted enough to save. But wars didn't always start with the first shot. Sometimes they started with a woman raising her hand at an auction, refusing to let go. Nathaniel didn't leave that morning. He tied his horse to the post and rolled his sleeves and walked straight into the barn, like he already belonged there. And Odessa stood in the doorway a moment, just watching him study the donkeys, one hand resting on the gray Jenny's neck like he was reading something written in her hide. "This one's the leader," he said. "You can tell by how the others watch her instead of the gate." "Her name's Juniper," Odessa said. She hadn't meant to name her. It came out anyway, like it had been sitting in her mouth since yesterday waiting for permission. "Juniper." Nathaniel repeated it slow, testing the weight of it. "Fitting. Tough little tree that grows where nothing else will." "That's supposed to be a compliment." "Only if you want it to be, ma'am." Odessa felt the corner of her mouth twitch, the first thing close to a smile she'd managed in 2 days, and she hated herself a little, for it hated how easy it was to forget the weight in her chest for half a second when a stranger said something almost kind. Then she remembered the 4 months circled on the mortgage note, and the smile went away as fast as it came. "We don't have sheep," she said. "Can't train a guardian without something to guard." Nathaniel nodded slowly, chewing on that. "No, but we've got time before the training matters. Much animals need to trust a place before they'll fight for it. First thing's earning their trust. Sheep can come second." "And how do we earn a donkey's trust?" "Same way you earn anybody's. Show up. Don't lie to 'em. Feed 'em when you say you will." By noon, they'd rigged a rope line along the inside of the barn, 6 lead lines running to 6 posts, and Odessa spent an hour just standing among them, letting them smell her hands, learn the sound of her voice. Juniper came around first, nosed at her sleeve, then her pocket, hunting for something that wasn't there. "Sorry, girl, nothing to give you. Here." Nathaniel dug in his saddlebag and came back with a fistful of dried apple, pressed it into her palm. "Company gift. Figured you'd need it more than my horse would." Odessa looked at the apple, then at him. "You planned on this, coming here." "I planned on introducing myself. The rest just seemed like the decent thing to do once I got here." He shrugged, easy, unbothered. Man doesn't like watching a woman fight a war alone when he's got 2 working hands doing nothing useful. "I didn't ask for help." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He held her eyes a second too long, steady, no mockery in it. "Doesn't mean you don't need it." She wanted to be angry at that. Found she couldn't quite manage it. She took the apple instead and fed it to Juniper piece by piece. And the Jenny's ears came forward for the first time since the auction, soft instead of pinned, and something in Odessa's chest loosened another half-inch. The piece didn't last past sundown. She heard the wagon before she saw it. Heavy wheels moving fast, the kind of fast that meant trouble instead of hurry. Nathaniel was already at the fence line checking posts when he straightened and looked toward the road, and Odessa came out of the barn, wiping her hands on her apron, just in time to watch Caleb Rourke's wagon roll up to her gate like he owned the ground it sat on. He didn't get down right away, just sat there, looking at the barn, looking at Nathaniel, looking at her doing the arithmetic men like him always did when they saw a woman standing next to another man who wasn't her husband. "Didn't waste much time, did you, Mrs. Whitlock?" he said finally. "Waste on what, Mr. Rourke? Replacing Ellis." He climbed down slow, deliberate boots, hitting the dirt hard enough to kick up dust. 2 days in the ground, and already you've got a man in your barn." Odessa felt the words land like a slap. Felt. Nathaniel go still beside her, felt her own hands curl into fists at her sides before she made herself unclench them. "Mr. Cole is helping me with the animals," she said, voice flat and cold. "Same as any neighbor would." Neighbor. Rourke's mouth curved around the word like it tasted good to him. "Funny. I've been your neighbor 11 years, Mrs. Whitlock. Never once thought to come rushing over the morning after a funeral. Maybe that says more about you than it does about him." The silence after that was sharp enough to cut skin. Rourke's jaw worked, and for a moment Odessa thought he might actually come at her, might close the distance and say something even Nathaniel's presence couldn't stop him from saying. Instead, he laughed short, ugly, no humor in it at all. "You've got fire, I'll give you that. Ellis always said you did. Didn't do him much good, though, did it? Man still ended up in the ground ranch, still ended up drowning in debt. And here you are, talking back to men twice your worth, like it's going to change any of that. Get off my land." "Your land." He said it like the words amused him. "For now. Bank's got the deed marked same as I do. Come autumn, we'll see whose land it really is." He climbed back up into the wagon, unhurried, savoring every second of her silence. "I came by to make an offer, actually. Generous one, considering. I'll take those donkeys off your hands, spare you the embarrassment of watching them starve when you can't afford the feed. $2 a head, more than fair. They're not for sale. They will be." He snapped the reins. "Everything's for sale eventually, Mrs. Whitlock. Man just has to wait long enough." He rode off without looking back, and Odessa stood there shaking. Not from fear, she told herself, from anger, pure and simple, until Nathaniel's hand landed light on her shoulder. "Don't let him see it get to you," he said quietly. "That's what he's fishing for." "I know that. I know you know it. Doesn't mean it's easy." She looked at him, then really looked, and found something steadying in his face that she hadn't expected to find in anyone ever again after Ellis. "Why are you really here, Nathaniel?" He was quiet a long moment. "Told you. Coyote problem of my own." "That's not the whole truth." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." But he didn't offer the rest, and she didn't push, and the two of them stood there in the fading light, with Rourke's dust still hanging in the air between them, and the animals shifting restless in the barn behind them, and something unspoken settled into place that neither one of them was ready to name yet. The rumors started the next morning, same as Odessa knew they would, spreading through the county faster than any wildfire. She heard the first version from Mrs. Petrie at the Mercantile, who delivered it with the practiced sympathy of a woman who'd clearly rehearsed it the whole walk over. "I heard you've got a man staying out at your place already," Mrs. Petrie said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Awful fast, dear, if you don't mind my saying." "He's helping with livestock. He doesn't stay." Of course, of course." Mrs. Petrie's tone said she believed exactly none of it. "Just folks talk is all. Widow 2 days, buried man in her barn. You understand how it looks." "I understand how small minds make things look," Odessa said, and left the store with her flour and her pride both a little worse for wear. By the third day, the version circulating had grown teeth. She caught pieces of it wherever she went that she'd been carrying on with Nathaniel Cole. Before Ellis even died, that grief hadn't touched her, because there'd been nothing real to grieve, that the donkeys were just cover for something else entirely. William Hargrove showed up at her door again that evening, face set in the particular expression of a man who believed every ugly thing he'd heard, and was disappointed to find himself right. "I warned you," he said before she'd even gotten the door fully open. "I warned you people would talk." "People always talk, William. Doesn't make what they're saying true." "Isn't it a strange man in your barn morning and night, not a week after you buried my nephew? He is helping with the animals." Odessa said each word deliberate, and leaving before dark, same as any decent neighbor would. "If you came here to accuse me of something, William, you'd better have proof instead of gossip, because I buried your nephew with my own hands, and I will not stand in my own doorway being lectured about respecting his memory. William's face went red, then white, and for a moment she thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he straightened his coat and reached for the same weapon he always reached for. "The offer on the land still stands," he said. "Might be time to consider it seriously before your reputation makes the decision for you. Get off my porch." He left. She stood in the doorway a long time after arms wrapped around herself, feeling the county's judgment pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. And it was only when Juniper's low bray drifted from the barn that she remembered she had actual work to do. Actual animals, depending on her actual reasons to keep standing instead of sitting down in the dirt and giving up. She went back to the barn. She always went back to the barn. Nathaniel found her there an hour later, brushing down Juniper's coat, with slow mechanical strokes, her mind clearly somewhere else entirely. "You heard what they're saying," he said. It wasn't a question. Whole counties heard what they're saying apparently. "I could stop coming," he offered. "If it'd make things easier." Odessa's hand stilled on Juniper's flank. Some part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to protect what little reputation she had left, wanted to give the gossips nothing more to chew on. But a bigger part of her, the part that had stood in an auction yard 2 days ago and refused to back down from Caleb Rourke, refused now too. "No," she said. "I won't let them decide who helps me and who doesn't. I've buried enough this week without burying that too." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "All right then," he said simply. "We keep going." They worked through the afternoon in a silence that felt less like avoidance and more like understanding, stringing new rope lines, checking hooves, letting the donkeys grow accustomed to human hands, touching every part of them without flinching. It was slow, careful work, and Odessa found herself grateful for the mindlessness of it, grateful for anything that let her stop thinking about William's face, or Rourke's laugh, or the whispers trailing her through town like flies she couldn't swat away. "Tell me the rest," she said eventually, not looking up from the rope in her hands. "The truth you didn't give me yesterday. Why you're really here." Nathaniel was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "My wife died 3 years back," he said finally. "Fever took her quick, no warning, nothing to be done. County talked about that too, if you can believe it. Talked about how quiet I went afterward, how I stopped coming to church, stopped coming to town more than I had to. Called me strange. Called me cold." He kept his eyes on the rope he was coiling, hand steady despite the words. "Watched you stand in that auction yard refusing to fold to Rourke, and I recognized something in it. Recognized a person who'd rather fight than let the whole county decide her grief for her." Odessa's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. About your wife. Wasn't looking for sympathy, ma'am. Just answering your question." He finally looked up, and there was something raw and honest in his face that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "Guess what I'm saying is, I know what it's like to be talked about instead of talked to. Figured the least I could do was be one person who did the talking to instead." Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The barn settled into its usual sounds, donkeys shifting tails, swishing the distant call of some bird settling in for evening. And Odessa found herself grateful, fiercely and unexpectedly grateful for the strange, quiet company of a man who understood exactly what it cost to keep standing when the world wanted you to fall. The Coyotes came back 4 nights later. Odessa woke to Juniper's braying sharp and frantic, cutting through her sleep like a blade. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was even fully awake, rifle in hand, running through the dark toward the barn, with her heart hammering against her ribs. She found 3 shapes at the fence line low and fast, and Juniper standing her ground at the gap in the rails, ears pinned flat, braying loud enough to wake the whole county. The other 5 donkeys had clustered behind her, and for one terrifying moment, Odessa thought she was about to watch her entire investment torn apart in the dark. Then Juniper charged. It happened faster than Odessa could process, the Jenny lunging forward, teeth-bared front hooves striking out with a violence that sent one coyote yelping backward into the brush. The other 2 scattered, and Juniper pursued them 3-4 strides, before pulling up short at the fence-line chest, heaving standing sentinel over the gap like she'd been born to it. Odessa stood frozen in the yard rifle, forgotten in her hands, staring. It had worked. Some half-remembered fragment of her grandmother's stories, some desperate gamble made with her last $11, it had actually worked. "Juniper," she breathed, and ran to the fence, and the Jenny turned to look at her with something in her eyes that Odessa could only describe as pride. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She sat on the overturned bucket just inside the barn door rifle, across her knees, watching Juniper pace the fence line like a soldier walking a post, and she wept again, not from grief this time, but from something close to hope, something she hadn't let herself feel since long before Ellis got sick. She told Nathaniel everything the next morning, the words tumbling out faster than she could organize them, and watched his face shift from careful attention to something like wonder. "She held the line," he said, "by herself, against 3 of them. I saw it with my own eyes, and I still can't hardly believe it." "Your grandmother's stories," he said slowly. "They weren't just stories." "No," Odessa said. "They weren't." Something passed between them in that moment. A shared understanding, a shared triumph, small as it was, and Odessa felt for the first time since Ellis's death like the ground beneath her feet had stopped shifting quite so violently. The feeling didn't last. Word of the Coyote attack reached Caleb Rourke before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She never did figure out exactly how, though she suspected one of his hands had been watching her land closer than she liked to think about. He showed up at her gate just past noon, and this time he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Heard you had some excitement last night," he said, not bothering to get down from his horse. "News travels fast. Faster when a man's got reason to keep an ear to the ground." He looked past her toward the barn, toward Juniper standing calm and watchful near the fence line, and something calculating moved behind his eyes. "Donkey ran off some coyotes. That the story going around?" "That's not a story, Mr. Rourke. That's what happened." "Interesting." He nodded slowly, like he was filing the information away for later use. "You know, I've got the biggest coyote problem in the county this season. Lost 11 lambs just last week. If those animals of yours are half as useful as the story says might be, I'd reconsider my offer. Take 'em off your hands for something closer to fair value." "They're not for sale," Odessa said, same as before. "They never were." "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Whitlock." He smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. "You'll learn that eventually. Question's just whether you learn it before the bank forecloses or after." He rode off, and Odessa watched him go with a cold feeling settling in her stomach that had nothing to do with the morning chill. Rourke didn't make offers out of kindness. If he was suddenly interested in her donkeys, it meant he'd already started calculating how to take them from her some other way, if she kept refusing to sell. The next blow came from a direction she hadn't expected. She was in town 3 days later, picking up feed she could barely afford when the bank manager himself intercepted her on the boardwalk, a thin, nervous man named Harmon Pratt, who'd always struck her as more paperwork than person. "Mrs. Whitlock, a word if you have a moment." "I'm rather busy, Mr. Pratt." "It concerns your mortgage." That stopped her cold. He glanced around, lowering his voice like he was passing along something he shouldn't. "There's been interest expressed in purchasing the note from the bank directly." Odessa felt the ground tilt beneath her. "Interest from whom?" Pratt's silence answered before his words did. "I'm not at liberty to say, ma'am, but I'd advise you to have your payment ready well before the due date. Things have a way of moving quickly once a note changes hands." She didn't need him to say the name. She already knew. Rourke was trying to buy her debt outright, buy the very paper that could take her land, take it out of the bank's more patient hands and into his own, where he could call it due whenever suited him best. Foreclose the moment she so much as stumbled. She walked home that evening, in a fog of fury and fear, so tangled together she couldn't separate one from the other, and found Nathaniel waiting at her gate, having heard some version of the same news already from his own trip into town. "He's trying to buy the note," Nathaniel said before she'd even reached him. I know. Odessa. I know, Nathaniel. Her voice cracked on his name the first time she'd used it instead of Mr. Cole, and neither of them seemed to notice the shift until it had already happened. I have 4 months to prove this ranch is worth something, and now I might not even get that long if he buys my debt out from under me. Then we work faster. Nathaniel's jaw was set hard and determined. We get sheep. We build the flock. We prove those donkeys are worth more standing guard on your land than dead in Rourke's slaughter pen. With what money, Nathaniel, I don't have a cent left to buy sheep with. He was quiet a moment, and something in his expression told her he was working up to say something he'd already been considering. I've got 20 ewes on my own place, he said finally. More than I need for the size of my land. I could bring a dozen over. Consider it an investment. If this works on your land, it works on mine too, and we've both got a chance at surviving this coyote season instead of losing everything to it. I can't ask that of you. You're not asking. I'm offering. He held her gaze steady and certain. Let me help you, Odessa. Really help. Not just fence posts and rope lines. She wanted to refuse out of pride alone. But pride didn't pay mortgages, and pride wasn't going to stop Caleb Rourke from taking everything Ellis had built if she let it stand between her and the one real chance she had. All right, she said quietly. Bring the ewes. The 12 sheep arrived 2 days later, and the transformation in the donkeys was almost immediate. Juniper took to them like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this purpose, positioning herself at the center of the small flock, within hours the other 5 donkeys falling into loose formation around her without any training. Odessa or Nathaniel had actually given them. Instinct, Nathaniel said, watching from the fence with something like awe in his voice. Pure instinct. They know what they're for. Or they remember what they were bred for generations back before folks forgot the use of it. Same thing, maybe. They fell into an easy rhythm over the following days. Mornings spent moving the flock to fresh grass, afternoons spent reinforcing the fence line. Evenings spent simply watching the animals settle into their new roles. Donkeys and sheep learning each other's rhythms like old friends, instead of strangers thrown together out of desperation. Odessa found herself against every instinct toward caution, starting to look forward to Nathaniel's arrival each morning. Found herself noticing things she hadn't let herself notice in years, the way he laughed, quiet and unexpected at something one of the ewes did. The careful, patient way he handled every animal like it deserved his full attention. The steady, unshakable calm he brought to a house that had been nothing but grief and fear since the day Ellis died. She told herself it meant nothing. Told herself grief made a person vulnerable to exactly this kind of foolishness, made a person mistake gratitude for something deeper. She wasn't entirely sure she believed herself. The second coyote attack came 10 nights after the first, and this time it wasn't 3 animals testing the fence line. It was a full pack, 6 or 7 strong, moving with the kind of coordinated hunger that meant they'd already scouted the ranch and found what they were looking for. Odessa heard the commotion before she was even fully out of bed, braying frantic and multiplied now. 6 donkeys instead of 1, screaming into the dark. She ran for the barn with Nathaniel's warning echoing in her head, something he'd told her just that afternoon, almost like he'd known. If it's ever more than 2 or 3, he'd said, don't go in swinging blind. Get light first. Coyotes in numbers get bold. Bold coyotes don't always run. She grabbed the lantern before the rifle hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the match twice, and by the time she got it lit and got outside the scene in the moonlight, stopped her cold. The donkeys had formed a ring, actually formed it deliberate and coordinated. Sheep pressed tight in the center, while 6 animals faced outward in a rough circle, striking and screaming at anything that came within range. It was chaos, and it was also somehow the most organized thing Odessa had ever witnessed an animal do. But the coyotes weren't backing off this time. There were too many of them, and they were working the edges of the circle, testing weak points. And even as Odessa watched, one broke through near the eastern gap and got teeth into a ewe's flank before Juniper spun and drove it off with a scream of fury that Odessa felt in her own chest. "Nathaniel!" she screamed, though she knew he was 2 miles off and couldn't possibly hear her, And then she was running for the gap herself, rifle raised, firing into the dark more to scatter than to hit anything. And the sound of the shot finally did what the donkey's screaming hadn't quite managed. Sent the whole pack scattering into the brush, gone as fast as they'd come. She stood in the sudden silence, chest-heaving rifle smoking in her hands, and surveyed the damage in the shaking lantern light. One ewe injured, bleeding, but alive. The donkey scraped and winded, but standing. And Juniper planted in the center of it all, watching the tree line with an intensity that told Odessa the pack hadn't given up. Not yet. They'd be back. She spent the rest of the night tending the injured ewe by lantern light, hands steady now that the adrenaline had drained out of her, and it wasn't until dawn that she finally let herself sit down and shake properly, the full weight of how close she'd come to losing everything finally catching up to her all at once. Nathaniel arrived at first light and found her still sitting in the dirt outside the barn, and the look on his face when she told him what had happened was something between fury and terror that she hadn't expected from a man usually so carefully composed. "You went out there alone," he said, "in the dark, against a full pack." "What was I supposed to do?" Nathaniel lay in bed and listened to them die. "You were supposed to be careful." "I was careful enough to still be standing here." He raked a hand through his hair, visibly working to steady himself. "You could have been killed, Odessa. Do you understand that? A pack that size, that bold. I understand it better than you do, since I was the one standing in the middle of it." Her voice cracked exhaustion and fear finally breaking through the composure she'd been holding on to by threads. "I don't have the luxury of being careful, Nathaniel. I don't have a husband to lean on or a fortune to fall back on. I have 6 donkeys and 12 sheep and 4 months to prove this land is worth saving. And if that means running out into the dark with a rifle when things go wrong, then that's what I'll do every single time. Because the alternative is losing everything Ellis ever built." The silence between them stretched long and taut. Then Nathaniel closed the distance between them, and before either of them seemed to fully decide it was happening, pulled her into his arms, careful and hesitant, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't pull away. She stood there in the circle of his arms, exhausted and shaking, and let herself be held for the first time since Ellis died, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for weeks finally loosened. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do," Nathaniel said quietly into her hair. "I'm trying to tell you I don't want to lose you too." Odessa pulled back just enough to look at him, and whatever he saw in her face made him go very still. "Nathaniel, I know," he said. "I know it's too soon. I know what the county will say if they see this. I'm not asking you for anything, Odessa. I'm just telling you the truth, same as you asked me to that first week." She should have stepped back. Every practical instinct told her to step back, to remember Ellis barely cold in the ground, to remember the mortgage, and Rourke and William circling like vultures, waiting for her to fall. Instead, she stood there in the gray morning light, in the arms of a man who'd shown up out of nowhere and given her nothing but honesty and steady hands and quiet patience since the worst week of her life, and she found she didn't want to step back at all. "We don't have time for this," she said finally, though her voice had lost most of its conviction. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "We don't. Coyote's'll be back tonight or the night after, and Rourke's circling your debt like a shark smelling blood, and half the county's already decided who you are before you've said a word to defend yourself." He held her eyes steady and unflinching. "Doesn't mean I stop noticing you're the strongest woman I've ever met. Just means I'll wait as long as you need me to before I say anything more about it." Odessa didn't answer. Couldn't really, her throat too tight, her heart too full of things she wasn't ready to name. She simply nodded and stepped back, and the two of them turned toward the wounded ewe and the exhausted donkeys and the long list of repairs the night had left behind. And they got to work, because that was the only thing either of them knew how to do, with feelings too large and too dangerous to say out loud. Three days later, William Hargrove came back, and this time he wasn't alone. He brought the bank manager with him. Harmon Pratt looking distinctly uncomfortable, clutching a leather folder to his chest, like it might protect him from whatever was about to happen. Odessa met them at the gate with flowers still on her hands from the morning's baking, and the sight of the two of them together sent a cold spike of dread straight through her chest. "William," she said carefully. "Mr. Pratt, this is unexpected." "I imagine it is," William said. There was something different in his voice today, not the wheedling persuasion of his previous visits, but something colder, harder, a man who'd stopped asking and started closing in. "Mr. Pratt has news regarding your mortgage note." Pratt cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes entirely. "Mrs. Whitlock, I regret to inform you that the note has in fact changed hands. As of yesterday, the debt on this property is held privately." The world tilted. By whom? But she already knew. She knew before Pratt even opened his mouth to say, it knew from the satisfied set of William's jaw, knew from every warning bell that had been ringing in her chest since the day Rourke first offered to buy her donkeys. "Mr. Caleb Rourke," Pratt said, "the full amount purchased outright. He holds the note now, ma'am, not the bank." Odessa felt her knees threaten to buckle and forced herself to stay upright through sheer force of will. "That's not possible. The due date isn't for months yet." "The due date remains unchanged," Pratt said quickly, like he wanted this part over with as fast as possible. "But the terms of a privately held note can be renegotiated at the discretion of the holder. I'm afraid that's now entirely between you and Mr. Rourke." William stepped forward then, and there was something almost gleeful under his careful sympathy. "This is precisely what I warned you about, Odessa. You could have sold to me on fair terms, kept some dignity in the transaction. Now you're at the mercy of a man who has made no secret of wanting you gone. Get off my land, William. I'm trying to help. You are trying to profit from my grief, same as you have from the moment you walked through my door," Odessa said, voice shaking with a fury so complete it felt like it might burn through her skin. "Both of you off my land, now." They left eventually, Pratt practically fleeing, while William took his time, savoring every second of her fear the way he always did. Odessa stood at her gate long after the dust of their wagon had settled, staring out at nothing, feeling the full weight of what had just happened settle over her like a shroud. Rourke didn't just want her donkeys anymore. Rourke owned her debt now. Owned the power to call it due whenever he pleased foreclose, whenever suited his cruelty best, and there was nothing in any law or custom that could stop him from doing exactly that the moment he decided he'd toyed with her long enough. She had weeks maybe, not months. Weeks to prove the guardian system worked well enough, thoroughly enough, publicly enough that losing this land would cost the whole county something they couldn't afford to lose either. Weeks to win a war she'd thought she had a season to fight. Nathaniel found her sitting alone in the barn that evening, staring at nothing. Juniper's steady breathing, the only sound keeping her tethered to the present moment. "Odessa, what happened?" she told him. Watched his face darken with every word. Watched his hands curl into fists at his sides by the time she finished. "He can't do that," Nathaniel said. "There has to be something." "There's nothing, Nathaniel. He bought the paper. He owns the debt. The law doesn't care whether the man holding my mortgage wants me gone out of spite. Then we make it so he can't afford to want you gone." Nathaniel crouched in front of her, taking her hands in both of his, forcing her to meet his eyes. "We prove the guardian system works so completely, so publicly, that every rancher in this county comes asking for it. We make you valuable, Odessa. Valuable enough that Rourke calling in that note looks like the act of a jealous man trying to destroy the one thing that's actually solving the county's Coyote problem. And if it's not enough, if we don't have time, then we make time." His grip tightened on her hands. "I am not going to let him take this from you. Not your land, not your husband's legacy, not the thing you've bled and fought for since the day you buried him. We keep going, Odessa. We keep going, and we make it work." She looked at him, at the fierce, steady determination in his face, at the man who'd shown up out of nowhere and refused to let her fight alone, even when she'd never asked him to, and something in her chest, something that had been broken and grieving and terrified since the moment Ellis drew his last breath, found one small stubborn spark of hope to hold on to. "All right," she said, voice steadier than she felt. We keep going. Outside in the deepening dark, Juniper let out a low, watchful sound. Ears pricked toward the tree line standing sentinel over a flock that had become somehow the last thing standing between Odessa Whitlock and losing everything she had left in the world. The coyotes weren't the only predators circling her land anymore, and she was starting to understand that the fight ahead of her would take a great deal more than 6 donkeys and a stranger's steady hands to win. The letter came 3 days after Rourke bought the note delivered by a boy on horseback who wouldn't meet Odessa's eyes when he handed it over. She recognized the handwriting before she even broke the seal. Bold, slanted, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a man who'd never once doubted his own importance. Mrs. Whitlock, I trust Mr. Pratt has explained the change in circumstances regarding your mortgage. I am a reasonable man, and I have no wish to see a grieving widow put out on the road. I am prepared to forgive the entire debt in exchange for the land itself, plus the 6 donkeys currently in your possession. Consider this my final generous offer before I am forced to pursue less generous options. C. Rourke. Odessa read it twice, hand steady, even as her stomach twisted into something cold and hard. He wants the donkeys too, she said when Nathaniel arrived that afternoon, and she handed him the letter without a word of preamble. Not just the land, the animals themselves. Nathaniel's eyes moved fast across the page, and his jaw tightened with every line. He knows they work. That's why he wants them gone from your hands and into his. Or dead, Odessa said quietly. A man who buys something just to keep his neighbor from having it doesn't strike me as the sort who cares whether it lives. Nathaniel looked up at her, something grim settling into his expression. Then we don't give him the chance to find out. She wrote her refusal that same evening, short and unadorned, and sent it back with the same silent boy who'd delivered Rourke's letter in the first place. The land is not for sale. Neither are the donkeys. O. Whitlock. She half expected Rourke himself to come thundering up her road within the hour, red-faced and furious. He didn't. The silence that followed was worse. 3 days of nothing, no visits, no threats, no wagons rolling up her drive. And Odessa found herself checking the tree line more often than the coyotes alone accounted for, waiting for whatever quieter cruelty Rourke was planning instead. It was Nathaniel who finally voiced what she'd been too afraid to say out loud. He's not backing off. He said, the two of them sitting on overturned buckets just inside the barn door, watching Juniper pace her nightly circuit of the fence line. Men like Rourke don't go quiet because they've given up. They go quiet because they're planning something worse than a letter. What worse is there? He's already got my debt, already tried to buy my animals out from under me. There's always worse, Odessa. That's the thing about men who've never once been told no and meant it. Nathaniel rubbed a hand across his jaw, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I think we need help, more than just the two of us working this out by trial and guesswork. Help from who? Half the county already thinks I've lost my mind, and the other half thinks I've replaced my husband before his graves had time to settle. Not from the county. Nathaniel hesitated, and something careful crossed his face, like he was weighing how much to say. There's a man 2 counties over. Vaquero worked cattle down near the border his whole life. My father knew him years back. Knew him from the old operations in the nations, the ones I told you about. If anyone alive still knows the actual method behind what your grandmother remembered, the real training behind it, and not just the shape of the story, it's him. Odessa's chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to hope. You think he'd help us? I think it's worth a 2-day ride to find out. The man's name was Ramon Ibarra, and he lived in a small adobe house at the edge of a spread so modest it barely qualified as a ranch at all. A handful of goats, a garden, and a silence around the place that Odessa recognized instantly as the silence of a man who'd earned the right to be left alone. He was old. Older than Odessa had pictured, deep lines carved into brown skin, hands gnarled with decades of rope burn and hard work. But his eyes when he looked at her were sharp as a hawk's, missing nothing. Nathaniel Cole, he said before either of them had said a word, recognition warming his weathered face. Your father's boy. Been a long time. Too long, Ramon. This is Odessa Whitlock. She's got 6 donkeys and a coyote problem, and a memory of something her grandmother used to say about guardian training. We were hoping you might know more of it than we do. Ramon's eyes moved to Odessa, studying her with an intensity that made her want to straighten her spine and prove herself worthy of his attention. Guardian donkeys, he said slowly. Not common knowledge anymore. Most folks forgot it or never learned it in the first place. He gestured toward the modest bench outside his door. Sit. Tell me what you know already. Odessa told him the auction, the $11 Juniper standing her ground against 3 coyotes, and then a whole pack. Ramon listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable, until she finished. You did more right than most would have working blind, he said finally. The Jenny's instinct is strong, that helps. But instinct alone will get her killed against a pack determined enough eventually. What you need is training, real training, the kind that turns instinct into discipline. You'll teach us? Odessa asked, unable to keep the eagerness out of her voice. Ramon was quiet a long moment, studying her face like he was reading something written there. I am old Mrs. Whitlock. My traveling days are mostly behind me, but... He glanced at Nathaniel, something almost fond in the look. Your father did me a kindness once many years back that I never fully repaid. I will come. A week, maybe 2. Enough time to teach you what needs teaching if you and your animals are willing students. Relief hit Odessa so hard she nearly wept right there on the bench. Thank you. I don't have much to pay you with. I have to be honest about that. I did not ask for payment. Ramon said something stern, entering his voice for the first time. I offered because the knowledge deserves to survive, and because your Jenny already proved she is worth the teaching. Do not insult either of us by talking about money. Ramon arrived at the ranch 4 days later, riding a mule almost as old and unhurried as he was, and set to work immediately moving through the barn, with an ease that told Odessa she was finally in the presence of someone who actually knew what he was doing, instead of piecing knowledge together from half-remembered stories and educated guesses. First mistake. He said watching the donkeys mill loosely around the pasture is treating them like a herd instead of a unit. A unit has positions. A unit has purpose. Right now they defend because instinct tells them to. We need them to defend because they understand the shape of the threat and their place within it. How do you teach an animal to understand shape? Odessa asked. Repetition, pressure, release. Ramon moved to the fence, gesturing for her to join him. Watch the Jenny. She already positions herself at the center. Yes, good. Now we teach the others to hold their own ground instead of clustering behind her like frightened children. A guardian who hides behind another guardian protects no one. He spent the better part of the week walking Odessa and Nathaniel through drills that felt strange and slow at first, moving the flock in patterns designed to test the donkey's positioning, using a trained dog borrowed from a neighbor, to simulate predator pressure at controlled distances, rewarding steady ground holding and correcting the animals that broke formation and bolted. This is not fast work. Ramon warned more than once, watching Odessa's frustration mount on days when progress felt glacial. You want a miracle in a week. I am giving you a foundation in 2. The rest you build over months, over seasons. This is not something that finishes. It is something that continues. I don't have seasons, Ramon. I have weeks before a man who wants my land finds a reason to take it, whether I've paid my debt or not. Ramon's weathered face turned thoughtful. Then we work faster than I would like. But understand, faster does not mean less thorough. It means we choose carefully what matters most and drill it until it is instinct deeper than the instinct they already carry. The work consumed every waking hour. Odessa's hands blistered and calloused in new places. Her body ached with exhaustion she hadn't felt since the earliest days of her marriage, when she and Ellis had built this ranch up from almost nothing. But something in her chest was changing too, filling in the hollow space grief had carved out, replaced slowly by purpose, by the specific satisfaction of watching 6 donkeys transform day by day from frightened half-wild animals into something disciplined, something formidable. Nathaniel worked alongside her every day, and Ramon watched the two of them with an amusement he didn't bother hiding. "You two fight like an old married couple already," he observed one evening watching Odessa and Nathaniel bicker good-naturedly over the correct way to position a feed trough. "How long have you known each other?" "Weeks," Odessa said quickly, feeling heat rise in her face. "Weeks." Ramon's eyebrows rose skeptical. "Interesting. In my experience, it usually takes longer than weeks to learn a person's rhythms well enough to argue about feed troughs." "It's not like that, Ramon," Nathaniel said, though his ears had gone red in a way that undercut the denial considerably. Ramon said nothing further, but the knowing look he gave them both lingered long after the conversation moved on, and Odessa found herself thinking about it long after she should have been asleep, staring at her ceiling in the dark, feeling something dangerously close to guilt, tangled up with something else entirely, that refused to be named. The twist came on this 9th day, and it came from a direction none of them had anticipated. A rider approached the ranch just past midday, not Rourke, not William, but a young man Odessa didn't recognize, dust-covered, and clearly having ridden hard. He reined up at the gate, breathing heavy, and called out before he'd even fully stopped his horse. "Mrs. Whitlock, you Odessa Whitlock." "I am. Name's Silas Kepler. My family runs the spread just south of Rourke's land." He swung down, still catching his breath. "We heard about your donkeys. Heard they held off a coyote pack twice now." "Word travels," Odessa said carefully, glancing at Nathaniel, who'd gone still beside her. "Ma'am, I need your help." Silas's voice cracked with something raw and desperate. "We lost 18 lambs last night, whole flock near enough gutted before we even woke up. My pa's talking about giving up the ranch entirely, moving us into town, and He stopped, visibly steadying himself. "I heard what your donkeys did. I heard it might not just be luck. If there's any truth to it, any chance you could help us same as you're helping yourselves, I'd be grateful beyond what I can rightly say." Odessa looked at Ramon, who gave the smallest of nods, and then at Nathaniel, whose expression had shifted into something thoughtful and calculating. "This is it," Nathaniel said quietly, only to her. "This is the beginning of exactly what we talked about. Prove it works for someone else's land, someone else's flock, and word spreads faster than Rourke can smother it." Odessa turned back to Silas. "I can't spare you a trained donkey, Mr. Kepler. Not yet, they're not ready to leave this land. But I can send Nathaniel and myself to help you build fencing, and Ramon here can teach your family what he's been teaching us. It's not fast, but it's real, and it works." Relief broke across Silas's young face like sunrise. "Anything, ma'am. Anything at all. My family would be in your debt." Word of the Kepler family's visit reached Caleb Rourke within 2 days, same as everything else in the county seemed to. He arrived at Odessa's gate that evening with a fury barely restrained beneath his usual practiced calm. "You're teaching other ranchers now?" he said, not bothering to dismount. "Spreading this donkey nonsense across the whole county like it's gospel. I'm helping a family that lost 18 lambs in a single night, Mr. Rourke. Something I imagine you'd understand the value of, given how much you claim to care about this county's ranching interests." "What I understand," Rourke said, voice dropping into something colder, "is that you're making yourself difficult to remove quietly. A grieving widow with worthless donkeys is easy enough to ignore into foreclosure. A woman building alliances across the county teaching other families a system that actually works, that's a different problem altogether. Is that a threat, Mr. Rourke? It's an observation." He gathered his reins, preparing to leave, but paused, looking back at her with something almost like respect buried beneath the contempt. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for, Mrs. Whitlock. Doesn't mean you'll win, just means I'll have to work harder to make sure you don't." He rode off, and Odessa stood at her gate, feeling the familiar cold dread settle back into her chest, the brief triumph of the Kepler family's gratitude already curdling into fresh worry about what Rourke would do next. She didn't have long to wonder. 3 nights later she woke to the smell of smoke. Not close enough to be her own barn, thank God, but close enough that she was out of bed and at the window, before she'd even fully processed what her nose was telling her. Orange light flickered against the horizon, distant but unmistakable, and her heart dropped straight through her chest. Nathaniel arrived at her gate within the hour, having seen the same glow from his own land and ridden straight over. "That's coming from the Kepler place," he said grimly, already reloading his rifle. "Has to be. A fire. You think, Rourke?" "I think it's an awful coincidence, a family agreeing to learn your methods and then their barn catching fire 3 nights later." Nathaniel's jaw was tight with fury. "Get your rifle. We're riding over." By the time they reached the Kepler land, the fire had already been beaten back by a dozen desperate hands, working with wet blankets and buckets from the well, the barn scorched, but standing most of the damage contained to a feed shed that had gone up like kindling. Silas met them at the yard's edge, face streaked with soot, and something like barely controlled rage. "Started in the feed shed," he said, voice shaking. "No lightning tonight. No reason for a fire to start there on its own." "You think it was set," Odessa said. "I know it was set." Silas held up a scorched fragment of cloth, the unmistakable smell of coal oil still clinging to it. "Found this near where it started. Somebody wanted this fire, Mrs. Whitlock. Somebody wanted my family scared enough to forget about donkeys and guardian systems and anything else that might have been working." Odessa felt sick, felt the full weight of what her small victory had cost this family, even though she'd had no hand in setting the flame herself. "I'm so sorry, Silas." "Ain't your doing?" Silas said, though his voice shook with barely contained fear. "But my pa's talking again about giving up. Says it ain't worth risking a fire that takes the house next time, instead of just the feed shed." Nathaniel's hand found Odessa's gripping tight. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. Rourke's not just going to let this spread quietly. He's willing to burn a man's barn to stop it." "We can't prove it was him," Odessa said, though her voice carried no real doubt about who was responsible. "No," Nathaniel agreed grimly. "We can't, which means he knows exactly how far he can push before anyone can hold him accountable for it." The next morning brought a visitor. Odessa hadn't expected a lean, weathered man in a duster coat who introduced himself as Marshal Otis Beck, the closest thing to law the territory had riding out from 3 days' distance to investigate the fire. "Kepler boy says he thinks it was deliberate," Beck said, standing in Odessa's yard, with his hat pushed back, studying her with the careful neutrality of a man used to hearing accusations from every side of every dispute. "Says there's bad blood between your operation and Caleb Rourke's. Wanted to know if you had any thoughts on the matter." "I have plenty of thoughts, Marshal. None of them provable, which I suspect is exactly how Mr. Rourke prefers things." Beck's mouth twitched something almost sympathetic in the expression. "Rourke's got a reputation, ma'am. I won't pretend otherwise. But reputation isn't evidence, and I can't arrest a man on the strength of a rumor and a bad feeling, however justified that feeling might be." "Then what can you do, Marshal? Watch. Ask questions. Let it be known I'm watching and asking, which sometimes is enough to make a man think twice before he does something worse." Beck studied her a long moment. "I hear you've got something working out here. Donkeys standing guard against coyotes. Word's spreading fast considering how quiet you folks have been trying to keep it. It works, Marshal. That's the whole trouble near as I can tell. It works well enough that certain men would rather see it fail than let a widow prove them wrong." Beck's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "I'll be around the county a few more days following up on the fire. Might be I stop by again, see how your own animals are getting on. Strictly professional curiosity, of course." He left, and Odessa understood the unspoken message clearly enough. She had, at least for now, one more pair of eyes watching Rourke's movements. One more person who couldn't be so easily dismissed as gossip or grief-addled foolishness. It wasn't much, but in a fight that had felt increasingly like her standing alone against the whole weight of the county's cruelty, it felt like something. Ramon's training continued through all of it, unshaken by fire or threats, or the growing sense of danger pressing in from every side. If anything, the urgency sharpened his teaching, made every lesson feel more essential than the last. "The pack that hit the Kepler flock," he said one afternoon watching Odessa run the donkeys through a formation drill, "was testing weakness. Coyotes are patient. They probe before they commit fully. Your animals held twice against smaller groups. A pack that size desperate enough or bold enough will come for you again, and next time they will come prepared for what they found before. You think they'll come back here? I think predators return to whatever hasn't killed them yet, provided the reward is worth the risk." Ramon's weathered face was grave. "We do not have the luxury of slow training anymore, Mrs. Whitlock. We accelerate. We drill until your animals do not think about their positions. They simply hold them the way breathing does not require thought." The days that followed blurred into exhausting repetition. Dawn to dusk, drilling formations, testing responses. Ramon's sharp corrections whenever an animal broke pattern or hesitated too long. Odessa's body ached in ways she'd never experienced, even in the hardest years of ranch work with Ellis. But something fierce and determined had taken root in her chest that refused to let exhaustion win. Nathaniel worked beside her every step, and in the rare quiet moments between drills, Odessa found herself watching him with something that had stopped pretending to be simple gratitude weeks ago. "You've given up weeks of your own land's work for this," she said one evening, the two of them sitting exhausted against the barn wall, watching Ramon make his final rounds of the animals before dark. "Your own coyote problem, your own fences." "My land will keep," Nathaniel said simply. This felt more urgent. "Why?" He was quiet a long moment, and when he finally looked at her, something raw and unguarded had settled into his expression. "Because I watched you stand in that auction yard and refused to be broken by a man who wanted nothing more than to watch you fall. And I have not been able to stop thinking about you since." His voice dropped careful and honest. "I know it's not the time, Odessa. I know there's a mortgage and a fire and a man circling your land like a wolf smelling blood. But I am done pretending I don't feel what I feel, and I would rather you know it plainly than have you guess at it through half measures." Odessa's heart hammered against her ribs. Every practical instinct told her this was exactly the wrong moment. Exactly the reckless distraction Rourke and William and the whole gossiping county expected of her. She reached for his hand anyway. "I feel it too." She admitted the words costing her more than she expected. "I've been trying not to. Ellis isn't even—" "I know," Nathaniel said gently. "I'm not asking you to stop grieving him. I would never ask that. I'm only asking you to let me stand beside you while you do." Neither of them said anything more. They simply sat there, hands linked, watching the last light fade over a barn full of animals, training for a war that was rapidly becoming about far more than coyotes, and something settled between them that felt for the first time since Ellis's death, like the beginning of something instead of only an ending. The reprieve didn't last. 4 days later, Harmon Pratt returned to Odessa's gate looking even more nervous than his previous visit, clutching his leather folder like it contained something explosive. "Mrs. Whitlock, I'm afraid I bring difficult news." Odessa's stomach dropped. "What now, Mr. Pratt?" "Mr. Rourke has exercised his right as holder of the note to call for accelerated payment." Pratt's voice shook slightly as he delivered the words. "The full remaining balance is now due in 14 days rather than the original schedule. I am sorry, ma'am. I did try to advise against it, but the terms of a privately held note allow for 14 days. Odessa felt the words land like physical blows. "He's giving me 14 days to pay a debt that was supposed to take 4 more months. "I'm afraid so, ma'am." "And if I can't?" Pratt's silence was answer enough. He didn't need to say the word foreclosure. It hung in the air between them, regardless, cold and final. Nathaniel, standing beside her, went rigid with barely restrained fury. "He can't do that. There has to be some protection, some—" "The note allows it," Pratt said miserably. "I checked myself hoping to find grounds to advise against it. There are none. Mr. Rourke is entirely within his legal rights." He left quickly after that, clearly eager to escape the wreckage of what he'd just delivered. And Odessa stood at her gate, feeling the entire foundation of her careful plans crumble beneath her feet. 14 days. 14 days to somehow produce a sum of money she hadn't had since the day she buried Ellis, wouldn't have, even if every donkey and every sheep on her land sold for triple their worth. Odessa. Nathaniel's voice cut through the roaring in her ears. Odessa, look at me. She looked at him, feeling something close to despair clawing up her throat for the first time since this whole desperate gamble began. We're not done, Nathaniel said fiercely. 14 days is not nothing. We use every single one of them. Doing what, Nathaniel? I don't have the money. There's no version of 14 days that conjures money I don't have. No, he agreed. But there might be a version of 14 days that makes enough people understand what you've built here that losing it becomes a cost. This county isn't willing to pay quietly. His eyes had taken on a hard, determined light. The Kepler family, Marshall Beck, every rancher who's heard the rumors and wondered if they're true. We show them Odessa. We show all of them before Rourke can bury this land in paperwork and call it justice. Ramon, who'd approached quietly during the exchange, nodded slowly. The training is close enough now, not perfect, but close enough to hold if tested properly, if shown to the right eyes. His weathered gaze moved to Odessa, steady and reassuring despite the grim circumstances. 14 days is enough time for one more thing, Mrs. Whitlock. Enough time to make sure that when the test comes, your animals do not fail. Odessa looked between the two men. Nathaniel's fierce determination, Ramon's quiet, unshakable confidence, and felt something that had been threatening to break inside her chest steady itself instead. 14 days, she said mostly to herself, testing the shape of the deadline like a wound she was learning to carry. All right, 14 days. Let's make them count for something. Behind her in the gathering dark, Juniper let out a low, watchful sound, standing sentinel over a flock that had become in the span of a few desperate weeks the last and only thing standing between Odessa Whitlock and losing everything her husband had ever built. She didn't know yet what those 14 days would cost her. She only knew she wasn't going to spend a single one of them giving up. The first 3 of the 14 days went to letters. Odessa spent them at her kitchen table, with ink-stained fingers writing to every rancher within a day's ride, whose name Nathaniel or Ramon could recall: the Petersons north of the river, the Vance brothers, out past the crossing, old widow Marsh, who'd been running her late husband's cattle alone for 6 years and had buried more stock to coyotes than she could count. Each letter said the same thing in different words: come see. Come see for yourself before you decide whether to believe it. You're inviting an audience, Nathaniel said, watching her seal the last one. That's a risk, Odessa. If the demonstration fails, I lose the land either way, Odessa said without looking up. At least this way I lose it, having tried something bigger than hiding in my own barn, hoping Rourke gets bored. Ramon, cleaning tack by the doorway, grunted his approval without turning around. Fear makes small plans. You are done making small plans, Mrs. Whitlock. Good. The 4th day brought Marshall Beck back unannounced, riding up the drive at a pace that told Odessa before he even opened his mouth that something had shifted. Got a name, he said, dismounting without preamble. Fella who set the Kepler fire, ranch hand named Dutch Emery, drinks too much, talks too much when he's drinking. Bragged about it to the wrong ears in town 2 nights back. Odessa's heart lurched. Bragged about working for Rourke. Didn't say the name outright, smart enough not to, but he did say he'd been paid good money to make sure a certain widow's new friends thought twice about following her lead. Beck's jaw tightened. Circumstantial. Won't hold up as proof against Rourke himself. But it's enough that I've got eyes on Dutch Emery now, and enough that I believe you, Mrs. Whitlock, in case you were wondering whether anybody in this county did. Thank you, Marshall. That means more than you know. Don't thank me yet. Beck's eyes moved past her toward the barn, toward the flock grazing calm and steady, with 6 donkeys spread in loose formation around them. Man like Rourke backed into a corner with 14 days on a clock. He said himself he doesn't get careful. He gets desperate. Desperate men do reckless things. He tipped his hat. Watch your back, ma'am, all of you. He rode off, and Odessa stood there feeling the weight of his warning settle over her like a second shadow, one that hadn't quite existed until he named it out loud. Ramon intensified the training on the 5th day, running the donkeys through drills that pushed harder and faster than anything, before simulated attacks from multiple directions at once. Sudden loud noises meant to test whether the animals would scatter, or hold long stretches of forced stillness meant to build the discipline that panic couldn't shake loose. "They are ready enough," Ramon said that evening, watching Juniper hold her position through a drill that would have sent lesser animals bolting for the far fence. "Not perfect. Perfect does not exist in nature, but ready enough to prove what you need proven." "When?" Odessa asked. "When do we show them?" 3 days, Ramon said. "Enough time for your letters to reach who they need to reach. Enough time to rest the animals before we ask everything of them at once." Nathaniel, checking the eastern fence line a few yards off, called back without turning. "Might not get to choose the timing ourselves. Coyotes don't wait on our schedule." He was right, though none of them knew yet how right or how soon. The 6th day brought the first reply to Odessa's letters, old Widow Marsh, arriving in a rickety cart, with a face carved from decades of hard weather and harder losses. "Heard you've got donkeys standing off coyotes," Marsh said, climbing down without waiting for help, sharp eyes already moving across the pasture cataloging everything she saw. "Heard it from 3 different mouths, and every one of them swore it was true, which in my experience means it's either gospel or the biggest lie this county's told in years." "Come see for yourself, Mrs. Marsh," Odessa said. "That's why I wrote." Marsh spent 2 hours studying the animals, asking sharp, practical questions that Ramon answered with obvious respect for her experience, and when she finally climbed back into her cart, her weathered face had softened into something almost like hope. "I've buried more lambs to coyotes than I care to count," she said. "Lost my husband's whole legacy to it, slow year after year, until there's near nothing left worth passing down. If what you're building here is real, Mrs. Whitlock, you tell me. I'll be first in line, money or no money favors, or no favors. I'm tired of burying things." "It's real," Odessa said, and found she believed it completely for the first time since the whole desperate gamble began. The Petersons came the next day, then the Vance brothers, then 3 more families. Odessa barely knew by name, but recognized by the same hollow-eyed exhaustion. Marsh had carried people who'd been losing the same losing fight against coyotes for years, watching their herds shrink season after season, with no answer beyond more fencing, more rifles, more sleepless nights that never quite solved the problem. Word spread faster than Odessa could have hoped, faster than she suspected Rourke wanted, and by the 8th day, her modest pasture had become something like a pilgrimage site. Ranchers arriving in 2s and 3s to watch Ramon run the donkeys through drills, to ask their careful, hopeful questions, to leave with something in their faces that hadn't been there when they arrived. It was during one such visit, the Vance brothers watching intently as Juniper held her ground against a simulated charge, that the real coyotes came. Not at night this time. Midday, bold and desperate, in a way that told Odessa immediately something had changed in the pack's calculus. Hunger overriding caution, 3 animals breaking from the tree line in full daylight with a dozen witnesses standing at the fence. "Christ Almighty!" one of the Vance brothers breathed as the flock scattered into position and the donkeys wheeled to meet the threat without a single command from any human throat. It happened in seconds. Juniper charged first, driving straight at the lead coyote with a fury that sent it yelping backward, while 2 of the other donkeys flanked wide to cut off the pack's approach to the flock's exposed side. The 3rd coyote, bolder or more desperate than its companions, tried to dart past the formation entirely and caught a hoof to the ribs that sent it tumbling before it scrambled back into the brush limping. The whole engagement lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the flock stood intact, the donkeys returned to their positions as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and a dozen ranchers stood at Odessa's fence in stunned, reverent silence. "Lord," Marsh finally said into the quiet, "Lord, I've never seen anything like it in my life." Odessa stood there, shaking not from fear this time, but from something fierce and triumphant that felt almost too large for her chest to hold. Beside her, Nathaniel's hand found hers, gripping tight, and when she looked at him, his eyes were bright with something that looked dangerously close to pride. They saw it, he said quietly, only to her. With their own eyes unplanned, no staging. Odessa, they saw it. Word of the daylight attack and the flawless defense that met it spread through the county with the speed of wildfire. By the 9th day, Odessa's gate saw more traffic than the mercantile and town ranchers, arriving not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to desperate hope. Men and women who'd resigned themselves to losing stock every season, suddenly daring to believe there might be another way. Caleb Rourke's response came on the 10th day, and it came with a fury that told Odessa exactly how badly his plans had begun unraveling. He arrived with 2 hired hands flanking him, an unmistakable show of force, and this time he didn't bother dismounting or pretending at civility. "You think this changes anything?" he said, voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You think a yard full of gawking ranchers and a lucky coyote scare buys you out of what you owe me? It wasn't luck, Mr. Rourke. Half this county watched it happen with their own eyes. Half this county are fools easily impressed by a trick that'll fail the first time a pack comes hungry and coordinated enough to matter." His horse shifted beneath him, sensing his agitation. "You have 4 days left, Mrs. Whitlock. 4 days to produce a sum of money you and I both know you don't have. And when those 4 days end, I will foreclose so fast your head will spin, and not one donkey, not one gawking neighbor, not one hired vaquero teaching you tricks is going to change that outcome. Then I suppose we'll find out together, won't we?" Odessa said, holding his gaze without flinching. "Whether 4 days is enough." Something dangerous flickered behind Rourke's eyes, not the smug confidence she'd grown used to, but something rawer, something closer to genuine fear that his plans were slipping beyond his control. That frightened her more than his usual cruelty ever had. A confident predator was dangerous. A cornered one was worse. He rode off without another word, and Nathaniel, watching him go, spoke the thought that had already settled cold in Odessa's own chest. "He's not going to wait quietly for those 4 days to run out," Nathaniel said. "Not after what he just saw in your face. Men like that don't lose gracefully, Odessa. They break things on their way down." Ramon, who'd watched the entire exchange in silence, finally spoke once Rourke's dust had settled on the horizon. "He will come for the flock directly," the old vaquero said, grim certainty in every word. "Not through fires or paperwork this time. He has run out of patience for indirect methods. He will try to destroy what he cannot buy or intimidate away from you. How he wouldn't dare attack the ranch himself, not with the marshal already watching him over the Kepler fire." "No," Ramon agreed. "But there are other ways to destroy a flock than a man's own hands." His weathered face turned toward the tree line, thoughtful and troubled. "A rancher desperate enough, cruel enough, might know how to draw predators instead of merely waiting for them. Bait left at the fence line. Carcasses dragged close enough to call in every hungry thing for miles." Odessa felt ice settle in her stomach. "You think he'd deliberately draw a bigger pack onto my land? I think a man who burned a barn to slow you down would not hesitate to arrange a night your defenses cannot survive, if it meant watching you fail publicly enough that no rancher in this county would trust your system again." Ramon's eyes met hers, steady and grave. "We must prepare for the worst attack yet, Mrs. Whitlock. Not the worst nature sends, the worst a man arranges deliberately." They spent the 11th and 12th days in frantic preparation, reinforcing every weak point in the fence line, running the donkeys through drills late into the night by lantern light to test their discipline in darkness. Nathaniel riding to fetch extra rifles and ammunition from his own stores. Ramon teaching Odessa a dozen small tricks for reading animal behavior that might mean the difference between catching a threat early and being caught entirely unprepared. Marshal Beck rode out on the 12th evening, having heard enough rumor and warning through the county grapevine to take it seriously himself. "I can't post a man here permanently," he said, surveying the reinforced fence line with a critical eye. "Don't have the manpower, and technically nothing's happened yet that gives me legal grounds to." But I'll ride the perimeter myself tonight, and tomorrow keep an eye on anything moving that shouldn't be." "Thank you, Marshal." "Don't thank me. Just be careful." He looked at her with something almost paternal in his weathered face. "You've done something remarkable out here, Mrs. Whitlock. Whole county's talking about it different than they were a month back. Man like Rourke feels that shift, and it scares him worse than any coyote ever could. Scared men are the most dangerous kind there is." The 13th night, everything Ramon had feared came true at once. Odessa woke to a sound she'd never heard before. Not the sharp braying of a single alarmed donkey, but something closer to a chorus, all 6 animals screaming at once, and beneath it, a low rolling growl that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. She was at the window before conscious thought caught up with instinct, and what she saw in the moonlight stopped her heart cold. Not 3 coyotes, not even the 7 or 8 that had tested them before. A dozen, maybe more, moving out of the tree line in a coordinated wave that spoke of hunger sharpened by something unnatural drawn, she understood instantly exactly as Ramon had warned, by bait dragged deliberately close to call every predator for miles onto her land at once. "Nathaniel!" she screamed, though he wasn't there yet. Wouldn't be for precious minutes, and she grabbed her rifle and ran for the barn with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The scene that greeted her in the yard was chaos. Given shape, the donkeys had formed their circle, the discipline Ramon had drilled into them holding even against odds. This staggering, but the pack was too large, too coordinated. Testing every angle at once with a boldness that told Odessa these animals had been driven past ordinary caution by something more than simple hunger. She fired into the mass of shapes, scattering 2, but 3 more broke through the gap where the fence had been weakest, and one lunged straight for the flank of an exposed ewe. Juniper met it head-on. The collision was violent, brutal. The Jenny's hooves striking with a fury Odessa had never witnessed, even in their earlier encounters. And for one terrible moment, Odessa thought she was about to watch the animal who'd started this entire impossible gamble die, defending a flock that wasn't even hers to begin with. Then Nathaniel arrived, rifle blazing, and Ramon behind him on his old mule, moving with a speed Odessa hadn't thought the elderly vaquero still possessed, and the combined chaos of gunfire and donkey fury finally began to turn the tide. "Hold the gap!" Ramon shouted, already dismounting, moving toward the weakened fence with a length of rope in hand. Odessa cover him, Nathaniel drive the flank. They worked as a unit, human and animal, both for what felt like an eternity, but couldn't have been more than 10 desperate minutes, and when the last of the pack finally broke and scattered back into the darkness, Odessa found herself standing in the sudden ringing silence, with her rifle empty, her hands shaking, and Juniper collapsed on her side in the dirt, blood matting her gray coat dark. "No!" Odessa breathed, dropping to her knees beside the Jenny. No, please." Juniper's flank rose and fell, shallow but steady, and her eyes found Odessa's exhausted, but alive, and something in Odessa's chest broke open entirely at the sight of it. Relief and grief and fury all tangled together into something too large for words. "She's alive," Nathaniel said, kneeling beside her, already assessing the wound with careful hands. "Bad cut deep, but she's alive, Odessa. She held the whole night." Ramon crouched on Juniper's other side, examining the wound with grim expertise. "She will need tending, careful tending, but yes, she held. All of them held." He looked up, meeting Odessa's eyes across the injured animal's trembling body. "You have your proof now, Mrs. Whitlock. Proof no rancher in this county can argue against. But you have paid a price for it tonight that I wish you had not needed to pay." Odessa looked down at Juniper, at the animal she'd bought for $11 desperate on the worst day of her life, who'd become something between livestock and family in the weeks since, and felt a resolve settle into her bones, harder and colder than anything Caleb Rourke's threats had ever managed to produce. "He did this," she said quietly. "He drove that pack onto my land, deliberately knowing what it would cost, not caring whether it killed every animal I have left. We don't know that for certain," Nathaniel said, though his voice carried no real conviction behind the caution. "I know it," Odessa said, and found her voice steady, despite the tears finally breaking loose down her face. I know it the same way I knew the moment I saw his face after the demonstration that he'd stop at nothing to make sure I failed publicly enough to matter. She looked up at both men, something fierce and unbreakable settling into her expression, even through the tears. 4 days left on his deadline. 4 days, and I am done being afraid of what he might do next. Behind her in the barn, the 5 uninjured donkeys stood their post around the trembling flock, and somewhere out in the darkness, the scattered remnants of the largest pack the county had seen in a generation retreated wounded and diminished, driven off, not by luck or accident, but by discipline, by training, by an animal named Juniper, who'd bled defending a home that wasn't originally her own. Odessa gathered the injured Jenny's head into her lap, pressing a hand against the wound to slow the bleeding, and made a silent, furious promise to the animal, to Ellis's memory to herself. 4 days. She would use every single one of them to make Caleb Rourke regret every choice that had led to this night. Marshal Beck arrived at first light, summoned by Nathaniel's hard ride the moment the last coyote had vanished into the tree line, and he moved through the yard with a grimness that told Odessa he'd already guessed most of what he was about to find before he ever dismounted. "Bait," he said, crouching near the fence line where Ramon pointed him, studying the drag marks in the dirt with a tracker's eye. Something heavy hauled from the roadside dropped close enough to your fence to pull every hungry thing within 5 miles straight onto your land. He straightened jaw tight. This wasn't nature, Mrs. Whitlock. This was arranged. "Can you prove it was Rourke?" Nathaniel asked, standing close enough to Odessa that his shoulder brushed hers. A small, steadying presence she found herself grateful for, even in the middle of this fresh nightmare. "Not yet," Beck admitted. "Drag marks don't have names attached to them. But I intend to find out who hauled whatever it was that got dragged out here, and I've got a strong suspicion where that trail's gonna lead." He looked past them toward the barn, toward Juniper, lying on a bed of clean straw. Her wound bound tight with strips of cloth Odessa had torn from her own petticoat in the frantic hours before dawn. "How's the Jenny?" "Alive," Odessa said. "Ramon says she'll heal given time and rest." "Good." Beck's expression softened, just slightly. "That animal held a line last night that would have broken lesser creatures clean in half. Whole county's gonna hear about it by sundown, mark my words. Rourke wanted to break your credibility. Reckon he just built it stronger instead." He wasn't wrong. By mid-morning, word of the attack had already begun spreading, not the version Rourke surely hoped for, a failed system overrun and discredited, but the truer story carried first by the Vance brothers, who'd heard it from a hand riding the county road, then by Marsh, who arrived at Odessa's gate barely an hour after Beck had ridden off her weathered face set with a fury Odessa hadn't expected. 12 coyotes, Marsh said, climbing down from her cart without waiting for an invitation. 12, and your animals held the line anyway. I heard it from 3 different mouths already, and not one of them doubted it. "We lost ground," Odessa said. "Juniper's hurt bad. Juniper's alive," Marsh corrected, sharp as a whip crack. "Alive after 12 coyotes drawn onto your land, deliberate by a man too cowardly to face you honest. You understand what that means, Mrs. Whitlock. It means your system survived the worst test anyone could have thrown at it. And it survived because of exactly what you and that old vaquero built these past weeks." She reached out, gripping Odessa's hand with fingers roughened by decades of hard living. "I've got 6 ranchers behind me who want in on this. Real commitment, not just gawking at a fence. You tell me what you need, and we'll find a way to provide it." Something in Odessa's chest, some tight knot of fear that had been cinching tighter since Rourke's deadline first landed on her, loosened just slightly at the fierce loyalty in the older woman's face. "I need proof," Odessa said slowly, an idea taking shape even as she spoke it aloud. "Proof strong enough that even a magistrate couldn't ignore it. Rourke's trying to bury me in paperwork and deadlines faster than I can fight back. I need something bigger than rumor to fight him with." Marsh's eyes narrowed, sharp and calculating. "Then let's give you something bigger." The idea crystallized over the following hours, born out of desperation, and Marsh's stubborn refusal to watch another neighbor lose everything to the same slow, grinding cruelty that had taken so much from her own operation over the years. "There's a territorial livestock inspector," Marsh explained. The small gathering of ranchers crowded into Odessa's kitchen, listening intently. "Man named Aldous Finch. Comes through the territory twice a year, verifying loss reports, settling disputes between ranchers over grazing rights and stock damage. If he saw what your donkeys can do, saw it official, verified on the record, that's not gossip anymore. That's documented fact a bank or a court would have to reckon with." "Where is he now?" Nathaniel asked. "County seat far as I know. 2 days' ride." Marsh's expression turned grim. 2 days there, 2 back. You'd be cutting Rourke's deadline close to nothing. Odessa did the arithmetic in her head, felt the walls closing in from every direction at once. 4 days left on the note. 2 days' ride each way for the inspector if he even agreed to come at all, if he wasn't already committed elsewhere in the territory. It left almost no margin, no room for anything to go wrong. "I'll go," Nathaniel said immediately. "I can make the ride faster alone than any of us could together. Push hard, reach the county seat by tomorrow evening. Find Finch, bring him back by whatever means necessary." "That's reckless," Odessa said, fear spiking sharp and sudden at the thought of him riding hard through unfamiliar country alone with everything riding on his success. "If something happens to you." "Nothing's going to happen to me." He caught her hands in his steady, despite the urgency thrumming beneath his calm exterior. "Odessa, this is the only chance we've got. You need to stay here. Keep training with Ramon. Keep the flock ready to demonstrate the moment Finch arrives. I need to go get him. There's no other way through this that gets us there in time." She wanted to argue further, wanted to find some other path that didn't require sending the one person who'd stood beside her through every impossible turn of the last weeks, riding hard into danger alone. But she knew, even as the fear clawed at her chest, that he was right. There was no other way. "Come back to me," she said quietly, the words costing her more vulnerability than she'd allowed herself since Ellis's death. "Whatever happens, Nathaniel, come back." "I will," he said, and the certainty in his voice steadied something in her that had been shaking since the moment she'd found Juniper bleeding in the dirt. "I promise you, Odessa, I will." He kissed her, then quick and fierce in front of Marsh and Ramon, and the small crowd of ranchers who'd gathered in her kitchen, and if any of them thought it improper, none of them said so. Marsh actually smiled small and knowing, and turned away to give them what privacy the crowded room allowed. He rode out within the hour, and Odessa stood at her gate, watching him disappear down the road at a hard gallop, feeling the full weight of everything, now resting on a 2-day ride through country that had already proven itself dangerous enough for men with far less at stake than Nathaniel carried with him. The waiting was its own kind of torment. Odessa threw herself into the training with a ferocity that left her exhausted by sundown each night, working alongside Ramon to push the 5 uninjured donkeys through drills that grew more sophisticated by the hour, while Juniper healed slowly in the barn, her wound closing clean under Ramon's careful tending, her spirit clearly frustrated at being sidelined from the work she'd fought so hard to protect. "She wants to be out there with the others," Odessa said, watching the Jenny strain against her confinement ears, pinned with obvious irritation at being kept apart from the flock. "She is a fighter," Ramon said, checking the wound with gentle, expert hands. "Fighters do not rest easily, even when rest is exactly what their body demands." He glanced up at Odessa, something knowing in his weathered face. "You understand this feeling yourself, I think." "I don't have the luxury of resting, Ramon. 3 days left." "There is always a luxury for rest, Mrs. Whitlock. Most people simply choose not to take it, mistaking exhaustion for strength." But he said nothing further on the matter, returning his attention to Juniper's wound, and Odessa understood the gentle rebuke for exactly what it was, without needing him to press the point further. William Hargrove arrived on the second day of Nathaniel's absence, and the timing felt deliberate enough that Odessa's guard went up the moment she saw his wagon on the road. "I heard about the attack," he said, climbing down with an expression that managed to look sympathetic and satisfied at the same time. Terrible thing losing an animal to something like that. Juniper's alive, William. No animal was lost. This time. His tone carried an unmistakable weight, a warning dressed as concern. Odessa, I came to make one final appeal to your sense. Rourke's deadline is nearly here. Whatever pride has kept you fighting this long, surely you can see now that it's costing you more than it's worth. Sell to me before he forecloses outright and takes everything with nothing left for you at all. I don't have time for this conversation, William. You don't have time for anything else, apparently, given how close you're cutting things. He studied her, something almost genuinely troubled, crossing his features for the first time since Ellis's death. I know you loved my nephew. I know you believe you're honoring him by fighting this hard to keep his land. But Odessa, what good does it do him watching from wherever he is now, if you lose everything anyway, and have nothing left to show for the fight? The words landed harder than his usual pressure tactics precisely because they carried a kernel of genuine fear rather than pure manipulation. And for one unsteady moment, Odessa felt her resolve waver. Then she thought of Juniper, bleeding but alive in the barn. Thought of Marcia's fierce grip on her hand, of the Kepler family's gratitude, of a dozen ranchers who'd started believing in something better than the losing fight they'd resigned themselves to for years. Thought of Nathaniel riding hard through dangerous country at this very moment, risking everything on the chance that she was worth fighting for. I'm not fighting for Ellis's memory alone anymore, William, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. I'm fighting for something bigger than that now. A dozen families who've started believing there's another way besides burying their losses year after year. I won't abandon that because the fight got harder than either of us expected. William studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite respect, but something closer to it than she'd ever seen from him before. I hope you're right, he said finally. I truly do, Odessa, whatever you might think of my intentions. But if you're wrong, there won't be anything left for me to offer you by then. He climbed back into his wagon, pausing before he snapped the reins. 2 days. I hope it's enough. He left and Odessa stood there, feeling the weight of his warning settle alongside every other fear pressing down on her chest, wondering not for the first time whether she'd gambled everything on a hope too fragile to survive the deadline bearing down on her. Nathaniel returned on the evening of the third day, exhausted, dust-covered, his horse lathered from hard riding, but not alone. Aldous Finch turned out to be a compact, precise man in his 50s, official in his bearing, but carrying an unmistakable weariness that spoke of years spent settling disputes between stubborn ranchers who rarely agreed on anything. He dismounted, carefully studying the ranch with a professional appraising eye. Mr. Cole here spent considerable effort convincing me this detour was worth my time, Finch said by way of greeting. I have exactly 1 day to spare before I'm required elsewhere, Mrs. Whitlock. I trust whatever you have to show me justifies the interruption to my schedule. It will, Odessa said, though her heart hammered with the knowledge that everything now rested on a single demonstration, one chance to prove what weeks of desperate work had built. Nathaniel caught her eye across the yard, and despite his obvious exhaustion, something fierce and hopeful passed between them. Relief that he'd returned safely, and the shared understanding that the hardest test still lay ahead. You made it, she said quietly, once Finch had turned his attention to Ramon and the animals. I was so afraid. I told you I would. He caught her hand, squeezing tight despite his exhaustion. Rode through the night to make it back before Finch's schedule ran out entirely. It wasn't easy convincing him this was worth the detour, but once I explained what was at stake, the Coyote losses across the whole county, not just your own operation, he agreed. It was worth investigating officially. And if the demonstration doesn't go well, if something goes wrong in front of him. It won't, Nathaniel said, with a certainty that steadied something trembling in her chest. Odessa, I watched Juniper hold a line against 12 coyotes 3 nights ago. I watched 5 other donkeys hold formation around a flock, while everything came apart around them. Whatever happens tomorrow, it won't be because the system failed. It'll be the truest thing anyone in this county has shown an official in years. Finch's demonstration request, when it came the next morning, was more rigorous than anything Ramon had drilled them for. I don't want a controlled show, Finch said, studying the flock with the same appraising eye he'd turned on everything since arriving. Controlled demonstrations can be staged rehearsed to look more impressive than they'd hold up under genuine pressure. I want to see these animals respond to something they haven't been specifically trained to expect. Ramon's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. What did you have in mind, Inspector? Finch gestured toward a trained dog he'd apparently brought along precisely for this purpose. A rangy, sharp-eyed animal that clearly had experience simulating predator behavior for exactly this kind of official evaluation. Let's see how your donkeys respond to a threat approaching from an unexpected angle, at a pace and pattern they haven't drilled against specifically. Odessa felt her stomach clench, understanding immediately that this was no gentle formality, but a genuine test designed to expose weakness if weakness existed. She glanced at Ramon, searching for reassurance, and found only grim determination in his weathered face. Let him try, Ramon said quietly. If the training is real, it will hold against anything. If it is not real, better we learn that now than watch it fail against something that actually intends to kill. Finch released the dog at an angle Odessa hadn't anticipated coming from the northwest. Instead of the usual southern approach, they'd drilled most extensively, moving with an erratic testing pattern, clearly designed to probe for weakness in the formation's flexibility. For one terrible suspended moment, the donkeys hesitated, confusion rippling through the herd at the unfamiliar angle of approach. The flock beginning to bunch unevenly instead of settling into the practiced formation. Odessa's heart stopped, then Juniper, still favoring her healing wound, but refusing to be left out of the demonstration, limped forward from where she'd been resting and let out a sharp, commanding bray that seemed to snap the other 5 donkeys back into disciplined focus. They repositioned rapidly, adjusting to the unexpected angle with a fluidity that spoke of genuine understanding rather than rote memorization. And by the time the dog completed its approach, the formation had reshaped itself completely, flanking the threat from both sides with the same coordinated precision Odessa had witnessed against real coyotes. Finch watched in silence, his professional composure cracking just slightly at what he was witnessing. Remarkable, he said, finally calling off the dog before any actual contact occurred. I've evaluated dozens of guardian animal claims across this territory, Mrs. Whitlock. Most amount to nothing more than a single dog with decent instincts and an owner eager to exaggerate its effectiveness. This, he gestured toward the flock still holding formation despite the test having concluded, this is disciplined, coordinated defense. I've genuinely never seen anything like it. It works, Inspector, Odessa said, allowing herself for the first time to feel something close to triumph. It's not luck, and it's not exaggeration. It's real, tested, proven training that any rancher in this territory could learn if given the chance. Finch studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his professional expression. I'll need to file a full report, document everything I've witnessed here officially for the territorial record. He glanced toward Ramon. I'd also like to interview you at length, sir, regarding the specific methods used. Knowledge like this shouldn't remain confined to a single ranch if it can genuinely reduce the livestock losses I've documented across this entire county. I would be honored, Ramon said, and Odessa saw something like vindication cross the old vaquero's weathered face. Decades of knowledge nearly lost finally recognized as valuable by someone with the authority to preserve and spread it properly. But the triumph of Finch's official verification came crashing against reality within hours when Harmon Pratt arrived at Odessa's gate, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him, his leather folder clutched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Whitlock, I'm afraid the news I bring is not good. What now, Mr. Pratt? Mr. Rourke has requested the accelerated foreclosure proceedings begin immediately. Pratt said, each word visibly costing him something. He filed the paperwork with the county clerk this morning. Given your note's deadline arrives tomorrow, and given no payment has been received, he is well within his legal rights to proceed. Odessa felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, despite everything she'd just witnessed. Despite Finch's official verification, despite the growing wave of support from across the county. I don't have the money, Mr. Pratt. You know I don't have the money. I do know that, ma'am, and I am truly sorry. Pratt's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine regret. The proceedings will formalize tomorrow morning at the county courthouse. Mr. Rourke will take possession of the land effective immediately, unless the full debt is satisfied before that hearing. Finch, still present for the exchange, frowned deeply. This seems remarkably aggressive for a private debt holder, particularly given the demonstrated value of what's being built on this land. Mr. Rourke has made his intentions toward this property quite clear from the beginning, Odessa said bitterly. He doesn't want a productive ranch inspector. He wants my failure. He's wanted it since the day I stood against him at that first auction. Finch's frown deepened further, something thoughtful and increasingly troubled crossing his professional features. Mrs. Whitlock, I have no authority to intervene in a private debt dispute, but I do have authority to file my findings with the territorial record immediately rather than waiting for my return to the county seat. If what I witnessed here today becomes part of the official record before tomorrow's hearing, it may not stop the foreclosure outright, but it will certainly complicate any attempt to dismiss the value of what you've built. Would that be enough? Nathaniel asked urgently. Enough to buy more time at least. I cannot promise outcomes I don't control, Finch said carefully. But I can promise you this. Whatever happens tomorrow, it will not happen in ignorance of what I witnessed here today. That much at least I can guarantee. The night before the hearing passed in a haze of frantic preparation and barely suppressed panic. Odessa gathered every document she could find, Ellis's original deed records of every payment she'd made against the mortgage. Before Rourke acquired the note, the careful ledger she'd kept of every rancher who'd witnessed the Guardian system's effectiveness firsthand. It might not be enough, she admitted to Nathaniel, the two of them sitting exhausted at her kitchen table. Well past midnight, papers spread between them like the fragments of a losing hand. Even with Finch's report, even with everything we've built these past weeks, Rourke has the law on his side technically. The debt is real. The deadline is real. Then we make sure the courtroom understands exactly what kind of man is calling in that debt, Nathaniel said grimly. Marsh is coming tomorrow. So is Silas Kepler and his father. Half the ranchers who witnessed what your animals can do are planning to be there whether Rourke likes it or not. A crowd of sympathetic witnesses doesn't erase a legal debt, Nathaniel. No, he agreed. But it might make a judge think twice about how eagerly he grants a foreclosure to a man everyone in that room knows deliberately set fire to a neighbor's barn and dragged bait onto a widow's land to destroy her livestock out of pure spite. His hand found hers across the table steady, despite the exhaustion etched into his face. We've come too far to stop fighting now, Odessa. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. She looked at him, at the man who'd ridden 2 days hard through dangerous country, who'd stood beside her through fire and coyote attacks and every cruel maneuver Rourke and William had thrown at her, who'd offered his heart honestly, even in the middle of the worst crisis of her life, and felt something steady and certain settle into her chest, despite the terror of what tomorrow might bring. Together, she agreed quietly. Outside in the barn, Juniper's low, watchful sounds carried through the night air, standing guard even in her healing weakness, and Odessa understood with sudden clarity that whatever happened in that courtroom tomorrow, she had already won something Caleb Rourke could never take from her. She had built something real, something that mattered, something that had already changed the fortunes of families across this county, regardless of what any deed or mortgage note might say about who technically owned the dirt it stood on. Tomorrow would decide whether she kept the land. It would not decide whether the fight had been worth fighting. The courthouse was already crowded when Odessa arrived, and the sight of it stole the breath clean out of her chest. She'd expected Rourke expected. His lawyer expected the cold formality of a foreclosure proceeding conducted among strangers who cared nothing for what she'd built. She hadn't expected the benches packed tight with faces she recognized. Marsh sitting ramrod straight in the front row, the Vance brothers crowded beside her. Silas Kepler and his father near the back, a dozen more ranchers and their families filling every available seat, all of them turning to look at her when she walked through the door. "Lord," she breathed, faltering half a step. They came for you, Nathaniel said quietly, his hand steady at the small of her back. Same as you showed up for them. Rourke sat at the front with his lawyer, a thin, sharp-featured man Odessa didn't recognize, and when Rourke turned to see the crowd behind her, something flickered across his face that looked for the first time since she'd known him uncertain. Judge Averill Prescott took the bench precisely on the hour, a heavy-set man with tired eyes that suggested he'd presided over more foreclosures than he cared to remember, and expected this one to proceed with the same grim inevitability as all the rest. This court is convened to hear the matter of Rourke versus Whitlock regarding accelerated foreclosure on the property, formerly held by Ellis Whitlock, deceased. He glanced up from his papers, taking in the unusually full courtroom with visible surprise. I see we have an audience today. Interested neighbors. Your Honor, Rourke's lawyer said smoothly. Nothing more? Interested indeed, the judge murmured, and gestured for the proceedings to begin. Rourke's lawyer moved through the facts with practiced efficiency. The original mortgage, its acquisition by Mr. Rourke, the accelerated payment clause exercised within his legal rights, the deadline that had now passed without satisfaction of the debt. Every word landed like a stone in Odessa's stomach. Cold and undeniable, the plain mechanics of law unconcerned with everything she'd built in the weeks since Ellis's funeral. The facts are straightforward, Your Honor, the lawyer concluded. The debt is real, verified, and unpaid. Mr. Rourke seeks only what he is legally entitled to. Judge Prescott turned to Odessa. Mrs. Whitlock, do you dispute the debt itself or your inability to satisfy it by the stated deadline? Odessa rose her legs unsteady, but her voice when it came steadier than she expected. I don't dispute the debt, Your Honor. I dispute the circumstances under which it was called due, and I ask the court to consider what has been built on that land in the weeks since Mr. Rourke acquired the note. Objection, the lawyer said immediately. Whatever improvements Mrs. Whitlock claims to have made are irrelevant to the legal question of an unsatisfied debt. Overruled for now. The judge said something curious, entering his tired eyes. I find myself curious what has drawn half the county's ranchers into my courtroom today, Counselor. Let the widow speak. Odessa's hands trembled as she reached for the papers Nathaniel had helped her organize the night before, but her voice held steady as she began. 6 weeks ago, I stood in an auction yard and bought 6 donkeys nobody else wanted on the same day I buried my husband, she said. The whole county thought I'd lost my mind. Mr. Rourke himself said as much publicly that very day. She glanced toward him, saw his jaw tighten. What I was actually buying, Your Honor, was a guardian system nearly lost to memory animals trained to protect flocks from coyotes, the same predators that have been draining this county's ranchers dry for years without any real solution beyond more fences and more sleepless nights. She walked the judge through it methodically. The training. Ramon's arrival, the first coyote attacks successfully repelled the growing interest from neighboring ranchers, desperate for any alternative to their mounting losses. 3 nights before this hearing, she continued, her voice tightening with remembered fear. A pack of 12 coyotes attacked my property in a single coordinated assault far larger than any natural pack this county has documented in years. Marshal Beck can confirm the evidence suggests this pack was deliberately baited onto my land. Objection, the lawyer snapped. This is pure speculation entirely unsupported. I have a witness who can speak to the evidence directly. Your Honor, Odessa said. Marshal Otis Beck is present in this courtroom today. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Rourke's face had gone rigid, and Odessa watched with grim satisfaction as his composure began for the first time to genuinely crack. Judge Prescott's expression sharpened with real interest now. The court will hear from Marshal Beck. Beck's testimony was brief, precise, devastating in its restraint. He described the drag marks, the coal oil-scented cloth found near the Kepler barn fire, Dutch Emery's drunken bragging about being paid to discourage certain ranchers from following a widow's lead. I have no direct evidence naming Mr. Rourke specifically in either incident, Beck said carefully. But the pattern of events occurring precisely as Mrs. Whitlock's guardian system began gaining wider attention across the county strikes me as considerably more than coincidence. This is character assassination, Your Honor, not evidence, Rourke's lawyer said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. It is testimony from a sworn officer of this territory's law, the judge said coolly, which this court will weigh accordingly. He turned back to Odessa. You mentioned a territorial inspector's involvement, Mrs. Whitlock. Is that individual present? He is, Your Honor. Odessa gestured toward the back of the courtroom where Aldous Finch rose from his seat, official bearing intact, despite the obvious fatigue of his rushed return journey. Finch's testimony landed with the weight of official authority that no amount of Rourke's money could easily dismiss. He described the rigorous, unscripted demonstration he'd personally conducted, the disciplined formation the donkeys had maintained even under unexpected testing conditions. His professional assessment that the system represented genuine verifiable value to livestock operations across the entire territory. In 15 years, evaluating guardian animal claims throughout this territory, Finch said, I have never witnessed anything approaching the discipline and effectiveness demonstrated on Mrs. Whitlock's property. My official report filed with the Territorial Record yesterday afternoon confirms this assessment without reservation. Judge Prescott studied the papers Finch handed forward, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. This is remarkable testimony, Inspector. You're suggesting the value built on this property in recent weeks substantially exceeds the debt in question. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that what Mrs. Whitlock has developed here represents a solution to a problem that has plagued this county's ranching economy for years. Its value extends considerably beyond the immediate property itself. A ripple of murmured agreement moved through the gallery, and Odessa felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The cold mechanics of foreclosure law suddenly complicated by a reality no one had anticipated walking through that courthouse door. Rourke's lawyer, sensing the ground shifting beneath his case, tried a different angle. Your Honor, whatever the merits of Mrs. Whitlock's livestock methods, they do not change the fundamental legal reality. My client holds a valid legally acquired debt. The deadline for payment has passed. The law provides clear remedy in such circumstances, regardless of sympathetic circumstances or unproven allegations of misconduct. Judge Prescott's expression turned grave, and for a long, terrible moment, Odessa thought the cold logic of law was about to override everything else she'd built. Then Rourke himself, unable to contain his growing frustration at how thoroughly the proceedings had slipped from his control, rose from his seat. Your Honor, if I may, this whole proceeding has become a circus. A widow with some trained donkeys and a sympathetic crowd does not erase a legally valid debt. I purchased that note fair and legal, and I am entitled to what the law provides regardless of how many neighbors she's managed to rally to her cause. Mr. Rourke, the judge said slowly, you purchased that note directly from the bank, correct? At what I understand was a notably aggressive premium in order to secure it before other interested parties. Something flickered across Rourke's face, the first crack of genuine alarm Odessa had witnessed in him since this whole desperate fight began. I don't see the relevance of the purchase price, Your Honor. The relevance, Mr. Rourke, is that a man doesn't typically pay above market value to acquire a struggling widow's mortgage unless he has particular motivation for wanting control over that specific outcome. The judge's eyes had gone sharp, calculating. Combined with testimony regarding a suspicious barn fire and a deliberately baited coyote attack, both occurring precisely when Mrs. Whitlock's guardian system began threatening. What I can only assume was your own considerable investment in traditional livestock protection methods sold through your own operation. Your Honor, this is entirely— I am not finished, Mr. Rourke. The judge's voice hardened. This court takes accusations of arson and deliberate livestock endangerment extremely seriously, particularly when they appear calculated to destroy a legitimate competing enterprise through fear and intimidation rather than fair market competition. The courtroom had gone utterly silent, the weight of the judge's words settling over every person present like a held breath. Odessa felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it, watching Rourke's careful composure crumble in real time. before an audience that had just weeks ago been prepared to write her off as a grieving widow gone foolish with despair. I am not prepared to rule definitively on the arson and bait allegations today, Judge Prescott continued. Those matters require further investigation by Marshal Beck, and I expect a full report before this court in 30 days. However, he turned his full attention to Odessa, something almost gentle entering his tired eyes. I am prepared to rule on the foreclosure proceeding itself. Odessa's breath caught entirely. Given the substantial documented value Mrs. Whitlock has created on this property since acquiring the debt in question, given the serious and credible allegations of misconduct surrounding the circumstances of the accelerated deadline, and given this court's considerable discretion in matters of equity, I am granting a 90-day stay on foreclosure proceedings, during which time Mrs. Whitlock shall have opportunity to satisfy the debt through legitimate means, including, but not limited to, the sale of guardian training services, now clearly in significant demand across this county. The courtroom erupted, not in outrage, but in something closer to triumphant celebration. Marsh's fierce whoop cutting clear above the general noise, the Vance brothers pounding each other's backs. Silas Kepler's father openly weeping with relief. Odessa stood frozen at the center of it, scarcely able to process what had just happened, until Nathaniel's arms came around her from behind, steady and certain, and she finally allowed herself to believe it was real. 90 days, she breathed. 90 days, Nathaniel. 90 days is more than enough time, he said fiercely, for what you've already proven you can build. Rourke stormed out of the courthouse without a word to anyone, his lawyer trailing behind him, with an expression that suggested he already understood how badly the case had unraveled. Odessa watched him go, feeling something complicated settle in her chest, not quite triumph, not quite relief, but something steadier than either the simple satisfaction of a fight fairly fought, and for now fairly won. Marsh reached her first, pulling her into a fierce embrace that smelled of leather and hard work and decades of survival against odds that had broken lesser women. 90 days, Marsh said, pulling back to study her with fierce pride. 90 days and every rancher in this courtroom ready to pay real money for what you're teaching. You won't need all 90, Mrs. Whitlock. Mark my words. She was right. Word of the courtroom victory spread through the county faster than any rumor Odessa had ever witnessed, and within days, her gate saw a steady stream of ranchers arriving not merely to observe, but to formally engage her services payment in coin, in trade, in whatever fair arrangement each family could manage, all of it directed toward training their own animals in the guardian system Ramon had taught her and Nathaniel had helped refine. Ramon, watching the transformation with quiet satisfaction, finally allowed himself something Odessa had never seen from the old vaquero before: genuine, unguarded pride. "This is what the knowledge deserves," he said, watching Odessa walk a new group of ranchers through the basic principles of formation training. Not to die forgotten with an old man who remembered it too late to matter. To spread to protect, to be carried forward by hands willing to do the work properly. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Ramon." "No," he agreed simply. "And I could not have done it without your grandmother's memory surviving long enough to reach you, and your own stubbornness refusing to let that memory die unused." He studied her with something almost paternal in his weathered eyes. "You have built something rare, Mrs. Whitlock. Do not let anyone ever again convince you it was foolishness." But the 60 days that followed passed in a blur of exhausting, exhilarating work. Training sessions stretching from dawn to dusk, the mortgage debt shrinking steadily as payment after payment arrived from grateful ranchers across the county juniper, healing fully and returning to her position at the center of Odessa's flock with undiminished authority. William Hargrove appeared once more during this period, though his visit carried none of the previous pressure or manipulation. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing awkwardly at her gate, hat in hand. "I doubted you. Doubted this entire venture, thought you'd lost your senses to grief. I was wrong, and I've rarely been wrong about anything in my life, which I suppose makes admitting it harder than it ought to be." "Thank you for saying so, William. Ellis would be proud of what you've built," he continued, something genuinely moved crossing his weathered face. I see that now. I should have seen it sooner." He paused, seeming to gather courage for something further. "If you ever need anything genuinely, need not the kind of pressure I was applying before you have only to ask." She watched him go, with something like forgiveness settling in her chest, understanding that even the most stubborn cruelty could sometimes soften when confronted with undeniable proof of its own wrongness. The debt was fully satisfied on the 73rd day, 31 days ahead of the court's generous deadline, and Odessa stood in Harmon Pratt's office, watching him mark the mortgage note paid in full, with an expression of genuine relief on his own careful face. "I'll admit, Mrs. Whitlock," he said, sliding the satisfied paperwork across his desk, "I never expected to be signing this particular document quite so soon, given the circumstances under which the accelerated deadline first arrived." "Neither did I, Mr. Pratt, but I had considerable help believing it was possible." She walked out of that office into afternoon sunlight. The deed to Ellis's land, her land entirely unencumbered, secured through nothing but her own stubborn refusal to fold, clutched safe in her hands, and found Nathaniel waiting exactly where he'd promised he would be. "It's done," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, too simple for everything they represented. "It's done," he agreed, pulling her close. "Free and clear, Odessa. Nobody's land but yours." "Ours," she corrected quietly, feeling the words settle into place with a rightness that surprised her with how natural it felt. "If you're still willing to build something alongside me, Nathaniel. Not just donkeys and fences. Something more permanent than that." His answering smile held every bit of the quiet certainty she'd come to rely on since the desperate day he'd first ridden up to her gate. "I've been waiting for you to ask," he said, and kissed her there in the open street, in full view of a town that had once whispered cruel judgments about a grieving widow's foolishness, and found now that not a single voice rose to challenge what they witnessed. What? Caleb Rourke's fate, when it finally arrived, came not through further courtroom battles, but through the slow, inevitable collapse of a reputation built entirely on cruelty and intimidation. Marshal Beck's investigation, thorough and patient, eventually produced enough evidence to formally charge Dutch Emery with the Kepler barn fire, and the man's confession, made in exchange for leniency, named Rourke, explicitly, as the one who'd paid for both the fire and the deliberately baited Coyote attack. Rourke fled the territory before formal charges could be filed against him. His considerable landholdings sold off hastily to cover mounting legal troubles that followed him even in absence, and the county that had once feared his casual cruelty found itself within a single season largely rid of the man's shadow entirely. Odessa felt no particular triumph at the news, when it reached her only a quiet, settled satisfaction that justice, however delayed, had eventually found its way to the man who'd tried so hard to destroy everything she'd built. A year passed then, too, and the guardian system that had begun with 6 desperate donkeys purchased for $11 on the worst day of Odessa's life had spread across the entire county. Then, beyond it, ranchers from 3 neighboring territories eventually making the journey to learn what Ramon's patient knowledge and Odessa's stubborn refusal to quit had built together. Juniper lived a long, celebrated life at the center of it all, her torn ear becoming something of a legend among ranching families who'd never forget the Jenny who'd held a line against 12 coyotes and survived to train 100 more animals in her image. Odessa and Nathaniel married in the spring following the courthouse victory, a small ceremony attended by nearly every rancher whose flocks had been saved by methods born from an old woman's half-remembered stories and a widow's desperate gamble. Marsh stood as witness, weeping openly with a joy she claimed she hadn't felt since her own husband's better days, and Ramon, present for the occasion, despite the long ride from his own modest homestead, offered a blessing in Spanish that Odessa didn't fully understand, but felt completely regardless. The land Ellis Whitlock had built with his own 2 hands that his widow had refused to lose despite every cruel obstacle thrown in her path became something greater than either of them could have imagined. On that terrible day, she'd walked away from his grave with 11 desperate dollars and a stubborn refusal to be broken. It became proof that grief did not have to mean surrender. Proof that knowledge nearly lost to time could be resurrected by hands willing to do the difficult work of learning it properly. Proof that a woman written off by an entire county as foolish, as broken, as easy prey for men who mistook her grief for weakness could stand in the wreckage of everything she'd lost and build something that would outlast every voice that had ever doubted her. Odessa Whitlock had walked into an auction yard with nothing but $11 and a fragment of memory, surrounded by laughter and pity and cruel certainty that she was making the biggest mistake of her already devastated life. She walked out years later, having built a legacy that would protect flocks and families across an entire territory for generations to come. Not because anyone believed in her at the start, but because she never once needed their belief to keep fighting for what she knew in her bones was worth saving. She had bought donkeys nobody wanted. She had built something no one could take away.